Claire started with $4,000, a borrowed laptop, and a kitchen table that doubled as her studio. She listed a few prints on Etsy, just to pay the bills, just to breathe. Orders turned into months, months into years, and a side hustle into a business that would change her life. From the rat race to her own rhythm, from selling to survive, to creating to live. Financial freedom isn't about luck. It's about building something you don't want to run from. Watch the full story, how I turned a $4,000 side hustle into a seven-figure business. The bell above the cafe door gave its usual tired jingle as Claire pushed it open one final time. The sound had become muscle memory over the years, a chime that marked the start of 8-hour stretches on her feet, sleeves rolled up, smile ready, and mind already counting how many hours were left until she could take off the apron. The smell hit next. Burnt espresso lingering from the morning rush, caramel syrup still sticky on the counter, and the faint tang of bleach from the mop bucket in the corner. For 3 years, this had been her world. Morning rushes that felt like war zones, where every coffee order was barked out like orders in a kitchen on fire. Afternoons where time slowed, and she'd wipe the same table 3 times just to make it look busy. Evenings spent counting tips that barely made a dent in the rent. The apron was still warm from yesterday's shift. She folded it neatly, set it on the counter, and slid her name badge on top, Claire M., in black block letters. The simple act felt heavier than she expected. It was a ritual she'd performed hundreds of times, but this time was final. She was leaving, not for another cafe, not for an office job in the city. She was walking away to chase something no one here even knew existed, something she'd been building in secret after hours. For the past 18 months, every free hour not spent steaming milk or sweeping floors had gone in her Etsy shop, a tiny corner of the internet where she sold custom watercolor prints. It had started as a favor for her cousin, painting a quote for a wedding gift. Then a friend asked for one. Then a stranger. Then another stranger. At first, the sales felt random, like rain hitting different spots on a sidewalk. But slowly, the trickle turned into a steady drip. She stopped thinking of it as just extra money and started calling it her runway fund, the savings she'd used to buy herself time if she ever decided to leave the cafe. Now that fund sat at $4,000, enough to cover 2 months of expenses if she was careful. 2 months to prove to herself that this business could stand without the cafe propping it up. It wasn't a rash decision. Claire was deliberate, almost cautious to a fault. She'd made lists in the margins of her sketchbook, build inventory before the holiday rush, revamp product photos with better lighting, upgrade packaging to something that felt like a gift, not just a shipment, reach out to small lifestyle bloggers and local stores for collaborations, and above all, stop treating the shop like a hobby. Luis, the shift manager, was at the back counter, bent over the schedule clipboard when she found him. "You sure you don't want me to just mark you as on leave?" he asked, his tone half joking, half hopeful. She smiled, shaking her head. "If I'm going to do this, I have to go all in." He leaned back, crossing his arms. "Guess we won't be seeing you behind this counter anymore." "No," she said softly, "but maybe you'll see me somewhere else." Outside, the late October air was crisp enough to bite. The streets smelled faintly of rain, even though the pavement was dry. Claire zipped her cardigan tighter and started the walk home, each step a mix of fear and possibility. She didn't have a boss anymore. She didn't have a guaranteed paycheck. What she had instead was a small desk in the corner of her apartment and the belief, fragile but growing, that she could make this work. Her apartment wasn't large. 1 bedroom, 2nd floor, hardwood floors that groaned when you crossed them too quickly. The kitchen bled into the living space, and in the far corner sat the desk that had been her real workplace all along. It was cluttered in a way that made sense to her. Craft mailers stacked in neat piles, rolls of twine leaning against the wall, a small label printer humming quietly, jars of watercolor brushes lined like sentries. In the center, her sketchbook lay open to a half-finished floral design. This was where she had made every single dollar of her runway fund. This was where she'd stayed up past midnight packing orders after long shifts, triple-checking addresses, adding handwritten thank you notes because she couldn't afford to compete on speed or price, but she could compete on care. And now, the cafe was behind her. The safety net was gone. From this moment on, every sale mattered. Every delay had a cost. She brewed a fresh cup of coffee, Not because she needed the caffeine, but because the smell had become her thinking scent. The mug warmed her hands as she sat down and opened her Etsy dashboard. The numbers blinked back. Steady orders. Not explosive, but enough to prove that demand was there. Enough to build on. She pulled out her journal and wrote at the top of the page in neat block letters. Day 1 full-time. Underneath, she divided the page into 3 columns. Create, new designs, restock bestsellers. Market, schedule 3 social posts. Reach out to 2 potential partners. Manage, inventory, expenses, customer service. The structure calmed her. She had no clock to punch now, no manager to tell her when to break, no schedule made by someone else. But she had a plan, one she could see, touch, and cross off. She thought back to the hundreds of hours spent behind that cafe counter, the way her body moved on autopilot, the smile that sometimes felt plastered on. She didn't hate it, not exactly, but she hated the way it left her feeling like her time belonged to someone else, now belonged to her. The thought was both exhilarating and terrifying. By midnight, the first package of her new full-time chapter sat on the table, taped shut and ready for the morning post office drop. 1 order, 1 customer, 1 more step toward the life she was building. She ran her finger over the return address label, seeing her own name there. Not a company, not an employer, not a cafe. Just her. The narrator's voice would linger here. She didn't know if $4,000 would be enough. She didn't know if this gamble would pay off. But she knew one thing. She was done trading hours for minimum wage. And she was ready to see what happened when she traded them for herself. She closed her journal. The room was quiet except for the hum of the refrigerator. Somewhere outside, a car door slammed and footsteps faded into the night. She thought about tomorrow's to-do list, about the design she wanted to finish, about the photos she needed to retake. And somewhere in that quiet, the fear softened. Not because the risk was gone, but because for the first time, she felt like she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The first morning, without the cafe, was unnerving in its stillness. Claire woke not to the shrill beep of her alarm, but to a pale spill of sunlight stretching across the floorboards, dust motes drifting lazily in the air. No 5:30 a.m. scramble. No quick rinse of a travel mug. No panicked mental check of whether she'd remembered to defrost the muffins for the display case. Her phone sat face down on the nightstand. She hadn't checked it yet. A small rebellion against the reflex she'd built over years of early shifts. For a few moments, she let herself listen. The faint hum of the refrigerator through the wall, the rhythmic ticking of the radiator cooling down, a pigeon's muffled coo somewhere near the window. It felt like Sunday morning, except it wasn't. And that fact pressed against her ribs in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying. She swung her legs over the edge of the bed, the hardwood floor cool under her bare feet, and sat there longer than she needed to. Her apartment was still in that early light hush, a stage before the day's first cue. She'd imagined this moment dozens of times while pulling espresso shots or wiping tables. She thought it would feel like freedom, and in a way it did. But now, without the weight of the cafe's schedule tethering her, the hours ahead stretched open, wide, unmarked, and demanding. Claire padded into the kitchen, filled the kettle, and set it on the stove. The flame flickered blue beneath it, casting a faint shimmer on the metal. She opened the cupboard to retrieve her favorite mug, white ceramic, rim chipped just enough to make it hers, and dropped in a spoonful of instant coffee. The whistle of the kettle came slowly, almost reluctantly, and she poured, watching the swirl of steam rise and dissolve. The ritual felt different without the rush. Every motion unspooled at its own pace, stirring the coffee, setting the mug down on the counter, wiping a drip from the rim with her thumb. On the small dining table, her journal from last night waited. She opened it to a new page. The header from the day before stared back at her, in neat block letters. Day 1, full-time. She wrote Day 2 at the top of the fresh sheet and hesitated. The truth hit her then. There was no manager to tell her where to start, no punch clock to dictate when she was on the clock. The structure she craved wasn't going to come from schedule taped to the break room wall. It would have to come from her. She remembered something she'd read once in a business book. That time, once freed from someone else's control, can be the hardest resource to manage. It was the currency you could overspend without realizing it. So, before listing any tasks, She wrote a single question across the top of the page. What will matter most 6 months from now? She let the question hang there as she sipped her coffee. 6 months from now, she wouldn't remember answering emails within 5 minutes. She wouldn't remember fussing over which font looked best on her thank you cards. But she would remember whether she'd built something that could survive beyond this runway fund. Her pen began to move. Create a holiday collection ahead of schedule. Shoot professional-level photos for every product. Build an email list to bring customers back again and again. She circled each in red ink. Those weren't just today's tasks. They were the foundation. The late morning light had shifted by the time she tied her hair back into a loose bun and settled at her desk. Her oversized cream cardigan slipped off one shoulder as she leaned forward over the blank watercolor paper in front of her. It was pristine, unmarked, a little intimidating. She dipped her brush into water, then into a pan of deep forest green. The first stroke bloomed across the page, feathering at the edges like ivy creeping into frame. She worked slowly, letting the brush glide, turning leaves in her mind into leaves on paper. Normally, this was the part where time disappeared for her, where the outside world melted and only color and form remained. But today, her eyes kept flicking to the corner of her laptop screen where the clock glowed. Every minute now was an investment, and she didn't want to waste any. Around noon, her phone buzzed, a sharp little vibration against the wooden desk. She grabbed it without thinking, heart leaping when she saw the Etsy notification. New order received. Her thumb tapped it open, and she smiled. The customer's name was familiar. Someone who'd bought a single floral quote print in April was now ordering a set of 3 for holiday gifts. A repeat customer. It was like a quiet confirmation from the universe. She printed the invoice, slid it into her today's orders tray, and sat back for a moment, holding the paper between her fingers. This wasn't just about making sales. It was about trust. Someone liked her work enough to buy again, and that meant she was doing something right. The afternoon sunlight stretched across the floor in long, soft rectangles, moving like silent clock hands. She switched from painting to scanning, carefully feeding her designs into the flatbed scanner, then adjusting them in Photoshop, brightening here, sharpening lines there, making sure the colors matched the originals. Her printer hummed quietly beside her, the scent of fresh ink mixing with the faint aroma of her coffee. She trimmed edges with a steel ruler and cutting blade, signed each print in her looping script, and stacked them carefully to dry. When it came time for product photos, she cleared her desk and set up her studio, a white foam board propped against the wall, the tripod balanced on a stack of books, and a thrift store desk lamp providing extra light. It wasn't fancy, but it worked. She swapped props in and out, a sprig of eucalyptus here, a simple wooden frame there, adjusting angles and retaking shots until the prints looked like something you'd want to touch. Each click of the shutter was deliberate. These photos weren't just documentation. They were her storefront, her handshake, her one chance to make a stranger pause mid-scroll and think, I want that. By late afternoon, Claire's back ached and her eyes felt grainy. She'd been in constant motion, shifting between roles: artist, photographer, packer, marketer, customer service rep. The soup in her fridge called to her, and she ladled some into a pot, heating it while she answered a customer's question about international shipping. She ate at her desk, legs tucked under her, scrolling through her inbox between bites. When she closed her laptop for the night, she opened her journal again. On the page, she listed the day's tangible wins. Finished 2 designs for the holiday launch. Processed 3 orders. Retook product photos for 5 listings. Sent first collaboration pitch to a local boutique. It didn't look like much on paper, but she knew that if she stacked enough days like this together, the compounding effect could be enormous. The narrator's voice would drop here, slow and deliberate. She had traded certainty for a gamble, predictability for possibility. And while the cafe had given her structure, it had also kept her small. Now, the only limit was how far she was willing to push herself. Night crept in quietly. She stood at her desk, sealing the last craft mailer with a satisfying press of her hand. Tomorrow, the packages would leave her apartment and begin their journey to strangers' homes. She traced her name on the return address label with her finger. It looked right there. Her name, her handwriting, her business. It was a small thing, But small things, she reminded herself, had a way of growing when you tended to them every single day. 3 days into her new full-time chapter, Claire discovered that freedom carried its own brand of pressure. Not the sharp, immediate kind she'd felt at the cafe, the kind that came from a line of impatient customers tapping their feet, but a slower, heavier kind. The kind that came from realizing every single result was now hers alone to create. That Thursday morning started like the others. Coffee first. Journal open. 3 red-circled priorities written across the page. But before she even touched her brush, she decided to check her Etsy dashboard. The page took a moment to load. When it did, her stomach tightened. 7 open orders. That was good. 6 of them marked unshipped and overdue by a day. That was not good. Her printer had been acting strange the night before, a faint streak on one side of each print. She'd assumed it was a fluke, maybe a clogged nozzle she could clean later. But now, with orders late and customers expecting packages, later wasn't an option. She ran the first print job again. The streak was still there. A thin, ghostly line cutting right through the soft petals of her watercolor peonies. She turned the printer off, then on again. Ran the cleaning cycle. Wiped the rollers with a lint-free cloth. Tried another test page. The streak remained, stubborn, unbothered, like it had no intention of leaving. Claire sat back in her chair, rubbing her temple. This was the kind of problem she could never have had at the cafe. Machines breaking there was someone else's problem. There was always a backup espresso machine, always a maintenance number to call. Now, she was the maintenance number. Her first instinct was to run to the nearest office supply store and buy a replacement printer. But the numbers ran through her head before she even grabbed her keys. A professional-grade printer that could handle her colors without distortion wasn't cheap, and dipping into the runway fund now felt like cutting a hole in the bottom of her lifeboat. She checked the clock. It was barely 9:15 a.m., but already the day felt like it was closing in. She decided to try one last fix before committing to a purchase. She opened the back panel of the printer and peered inside. The faint smell of ink and warm plastic hit her, familiar but now oddly oppressive. She cleaned every reachable surface with precision, even the parts that didn't look dirty. When she ran the next test print, the streak was fainter, not gone, but fainter. It was enough to buy her some time. Still, she knew she couldn't ship anything less than perfect. She sat at the desk, flipping through her stack of finished prints, inspecting each one under the warm desk lamp. 3 were flawless. 2 had faint streaks she could maybe hide under the matting if she framed them. The rest were unusable. She sighed, setting the flawed ones aside, and made a note to email the customers with an update. Her fingers hovered over the keyboard before she started typing. She wanted to be honest without sounding amateur. "Hi, customer name," she began. "I'm reaching out about your recent order. I'm making a small adjustment to ensure the colors and quality are perfect for you. This means a slight delay, but I promise the result will be worth it." She hit send, feeling the knot in her stomach loosen slightly. Customers could forgive a delay, but they wouldn't forgive sloppy work. By noon, she'd packed the 3 flawless orders and walked them to the post office. The air outside was crisp, with that faint metallic scent of early winter creeping in. She tucked her hands into her cardigan pockets and tried not to dwell on the orders still unshipped. Inside the post office, the clerk recognized her. "You're in here a lot lately," he said with a smile. Claire laughed. "That's the plan. Small business. Trying to be." The words hung in the air after she left, bouncing around in her head on the walk home. Trying to be. Back at her desk, she looked over her task list. Today was supposed to be about creating, working on the holiday collection, shooting photos, scheduling posts. Instead, she'd spent most of the morning on troubleshooting and damage control. And yet, as she sat there with her coffee cooling beside her, she realized this was the reality she'd signed up for. Running a business wasn't just painting and packaging. It was putting out fires, solving problems, and making decisions that could mean the difference between growth and collapse. That evening, she called her friend Lena, who ran a small stationery business out of her home. "Printers," Lena said, groaning into the phone. "They're like toddlers, fine 1 minute, disaster the next." Claire laughed, tension easing. "I'm starting to understand that. Listen, don't throw money at it yet. Try this. Order a maintenance kit online. Cheaper than a new printer, and it saved me more than once." They spent another half hour talking about the realities of self-employment, the kind of conversation Claire couldn't have with her old cafe coworkers. They wouldn't understand the small triumph of finding a cheaper packaging supplier or the relief of getting a 5-star review after a rough week. When she hung up, Claire felt steadier, not because the problem was solved, but because she knew she wasn't the only one facing them. The narrator's voice would slow here. Her first snag wasn't catastrophic, but it was a reminder that this path would test her in ways the cafe never had. There were no safety nets now, only choices, and each one carried a cost. That night, she added a new line to her journal, under day 4 wins. Learned how to troubleshoot the printer, sent proactive updates to customers, packed and shipped 3 perfect orders, found a peer who understands the journey. It didn't look like a major victory, but in the quiet glow of her desk lamp, it felt like one. By Saturday evening, the week had blurred into a mix of watercolor stains, shipping labels, and the constant hum of her printer. The days felt longer now, not because she was working more hours, but because every hour carried weight. At the cafe, she counted time in shifts. Here, she counted it in decisions. She'd been avoiding the math all week. Not because she didn't know how to track sales. She did, meticulously. But because she wasn't ready to face the number that would tell her whether she'd made the right decision walking away from a steady paycheck. Still, as the last of the daylight faded and the apartment sank into a warm amber glow, she knew she couldn't put it off. She opened her laptop, pulled up the spreadsheet she'd started months ago, and began entering the numbers for her first week as a full-time business owner. 7 orders. 3 repeat customers. 4 new ones from different states. Her cursor hovered over the total column before pressing enter. The number appeared, stark and unembellished. $212.47. She stared at it. $212.47. It wasn't bad, not for a hobby, but for a living, for rent, groceries, utilities, and health insurance. It was barely a dent. Her stomach tightened. This was the part nobody talked about in those "I quit my job to follow my passion" stories. The gap. The awkward, terrifying gap between the fantasy of financial freedom and the reality of making it work day after day. She reached for her coffee mug, only to realize it was empty and cold. The apartment felt smaller somehow, the walls leaning in just slightly as she ran the mental math. Rent, $1,180. Utilities, $145. Groceries, $200. Health insurance, $280. Miscellaneous, phone, internet, the inevitable something breaks expense, at least $200. That was $2,000 in fixed costs. Her first week's income didn't even cover 1/10 of it. She pushed the laptop away and pressed the heels of her hands into her eyes. The narrator's voice would drop here. She wasn't failing yet, but the math was clear. Passion alone wouldn't keep the lights on. If she wanted this life, she would need more than art. She would need a plan. She stood and crossed the room to the bookshelf, pulling down the binder she'd labeled business months ago. It was thick with printouts, notes from free online courses, email marketing tips, lists of wholesale suppliers, articles on SEO. She flipped to the section marked Revenue Streams. Her handwriting filled the margins in different colors, proof of all the nights she'd spent researching after cafe shifts. Ideas leapt off the page. Sell digital downloads to eliminate printing and shipping time. Partner with a local frame shop for bundled sales. Offer limited edition runs at a higher price point. Teach a beginner watercolor class online. She tapped her pen against the page. She couldn't do all of them at once, but she could start with one. Her eyes landed on the phrase digital downloads again. It had been there for months, highlighted in neon yellow. The idea was simple. Customers could buy the art file, download it instantly, and print it themselves. No shipping delays. No printer malfunctions. No streaks across peony petals. It wouldn't replace her physical prints, but it could become a parallel stream of income with minimal overhead. She closed the binder and turned back to her desk, a faint pulse of energy replacing the earlier dread. The rest of the evening became an impromptu strategy session. She selected 3 of her best-selling designs, scanned them at high resolution, cleaned them meticulously in Photoshop, and saved them in multiple formats. Then came the listing descriptions, careful, enticing, but honest. She wrote them the way she'd want to hear if she were the customer. Warm, personal, promising quality without overselling. By the time she uploaded the first listing, the clock on her laptop read 11:42 p.m. She leaned back, stretching her arms overhead. The apartment was quiet except for the faint hum of the refrigerator. Tomorrow, she'd see if anyone noticed. Morning came slower than usual on Sunday. The light was soft, diffused by clouds, and for a moment she debated staying in bed. But habit pulled her up, into the kitchen, coffee in hand, and eventually back to her desk. Her Etsy dashboard was still open from the night before. She refreshed the page without much expectation. The number that appeared made her sit straighter. 2 sales. Both digital downloads. It wasn't a fortune, $24 total, but it was proof. Proof that she could create something once and sell it again and again without worrying about shipping delays or printer streaks. She poured another cup of coffee and pulled her journal toward her. Under day 7 wins, she wrote. First week complete as full-time business owner. Tested and sold first digital downloads. Identified new income stream. She sat back, pen tapping against the page. The week's income was still far from enough. But now, for the first time since quitting the cafe, she felt the faintest edge of control. That afternoon, she called her mother. First week down, she said when her mom answered. And, a little scary, Claire admitted. But, I think I might actually figure this out. Her mother laughed softly. 1 week at a time, honey. Claire smiled. 1 week at a time. That felt like something she could manage. The narrator's voice would steady here. Her first week wasn't glamorous. It wasn't a viral success story or an overnight fortune. But it was real, a foundation built not just on talent, but on the willingness to adapt. And that was worth more than any perfect week could give her. The Monday after her first full week was overcast. The kind of gray that made the streets look washed out, like someone had turned the saturation down on the whole city. Claire didn't mind. Gray days had a way of making her apartment feel cozier, the warm desk lamp glow more golden. She sipped her coffee and flipped open her journal, ready to sketch out her plan for the week. But before her pen touched the page, there was a knock at the door. Not the mail carrier. That was usually a quick buzz from downstairs. This was a deliberate knock, 3 short raps, then a pause, then another. She set her mug down and patted over, cardigan sleeves hanging loose around her wrists. When she opened the door, she found a woman in a rust-colored coat standing there, holding a small brown paper bag and a clipboard. Hi, the woman said, smiling. You're Claire, right? Yes. I'm Marissa. I run Gather, the little boutique on 6th Street. I live 2 floors down. Claire nodded slowly, recognizing the shop's name. Gather was one of those places that looked like it belonged in a magazine spread. Linen curtains, shelves lined with handmade pottery, candles with hand-lettered labels. Marissa extended the paper bag toward her. I bought one of your prints on Etsy last month, the Magnolia branch. I didn't realize until I saw your name on the package that we're practically neighbors. Claire blinked, taking the bag. Oh wow, small world. Marissa's smile widened. Listen, I've been meaning to reach out. We're curating a winter market in December, and I think your work would fit perfectly. Do you have time to talk about maybe doing a small collection for the shop? The words seemed to hang in the air between them. A boutique. A real boutique, with a storefront and steady foot traffic, asking for her work. Claire's heart gave a quick, hard thump. She invited Marissa in, clearing a stack of craft mailers off the armchair so she could sit. The apartment felt suddenly too small, too lived in, but Marissa didn't seem to notice. She was scanning the walls, where Claire had taped up some of her recent pieces, a loose grid of florals, abstract botanicals, and muted landscapes. I love that one, Marissa said, pointing to a tall eucalyptus stem done in ink and wash. Thanks, Claire murmured, tucking her hair behind her ear. So here's the thing, Marissa continued. We have space for about 6 local artists of the market. I'm looking for work that's seasonal without being cliché, pieces that feel warm and timeless. I think your style is exactly that. Claire felt a flicker of disbelief. She'd imagined her art in local shops, sure, but always as a someday goal, after she'd built more of an audience, after her sales were steady, after she felt ready. But here it was, knocking on her literal door. They talked for nearly an hour. Marissa explained the setup. The shop would display and sell the work on consignment, taking a percentage of each sale. Claire would set her own prices, supply the prints, and keep control over the designs. The catch: everything needed to be delivered by the first week of December, just over 3 weeks away. After Marissa left, Claire stood in the center of her apartment, the paper bag still in her hand. Inside was a small candle from Gather, a thank you gift for the magnolia print. She lit it on her desk and watched the wick curl into flame, the scent of cedar and vanilla filling the room. 3 weeks. It was enough time, barely. The narrator's tone would lift slightly here. She had wanted a sign that this path could work. She got it. But signs aren't guarantees. They're invitations. And invitations mean you have to show up. The rest of the day became a blur of lists. She filled a page in her journal with potential pieces for the winter collection. Snowdrop flowers in ink and watercolor. Bare winter branches against a pale sky. A wreath of eucalyptus and pine. Minimalist holly sprigs. Abstract washes in deep greens and warm grays. She sketched thumbnails beside each idea, not worrying about perfection, just getting the concepts out. By late afternoon, her desk was littered with reference photos, scraps of paper with color swatches, and her favorite brushes laid out in order of thickness. She taped the first sheet of watercolor paper to her board and began. Her hand moved faster than usual. Not rushed, but sure. She wasn't painting just for herself now, or for a faceless customer on Etsy. She was painting for a real space, a place where people would walk in, run their fingers over the frame, and imagine it in their homes. That thought made her careful in a new way. Every brushstroke had to be intentional. She worked past her, the candle burning low beside her. The eucalyptus wreath came together in layers, pale washes first, then the darker stems, then the careful shadows under each leaf. When she finally stepped back, she felt that quiet, deep satisfaction that came from making something that looked right. The next morning, she woke with the same urgency she used to feel before a cafe rush, but now it was for her own deadlines. She made coffee, tied her hair back, and picked up where she'd left off. For the next week, her life narrowed to a rhythm. Paint, scan, edit, print, package orders, check Etsy, paint again. She barely noticed the gray weather or the shortening days. Halfway through the second week, she hit a wall. The eucalyptus wreath, the snowdrops, and the bare branches were done, but the holly sprigs refused to cooperate. The reds looked too harsh, the greens too flat. She pushed back from the desk, rubbing her eyes. This was the part where doubt always crept in. The voice that whispered, maybe you're not ready for this. Maybe they'll regret asking you. Instead of fighting it, she decided to step away. She pulled on her coat and walked to Gather, the little bell above the door chiming as she entered. Marissa was behind the counter, rearranging a display of ceramic mugs. She looked up and smiled. Hey, artist. Claire laughed. Not sure I've earned that title today. They talked for a few minutes, and Claire found herself admitting she was stuck. Marissa nodded toward a shelf of winter-themed cards and prints from other artists. Go look at those, she said. Not to copy, just to remind yourself that there's no one right way to do this. Sometimes we get trapped trying to make something perfect when all it needs to be is ours. Claire lingered in the shop, running her fingers over textured paper, noticing how some pieces were bold and colorful while others were soft and spare. By the time she walked back home, she knew what she'd been missing: warmth. Her holly sprigs had been technically fine, but they felt cold, like they were painted from memory instead of from life. She brewed another cup of coffee, sat down, and started fresh. This time, she thought of the holly wreath that had hung on her grandmother's door every December, the one she used to trace with her fingers as a child. The memory shifted the colors in her mind, softened the reds, deepened the greens. When she finished, she smiled. It felt right again. The last week before the deadline was a sprint. She framed each piece, signed the backs in gold ink, and packed them in careful layers of craft paper and bubble wrap. The morning she carried the box to Gather, the air was crisp and bright, the kind of winter sun that makes everything feel sharper. Marissa met her at the counter, peeling back the paper to reveal each print. These are perfect, she said simply, and Claire felt something in her chest loosen. She had imagined her first breakthrough would feel like fireworks. Instead, it felt like steady hands and a quiet, these are perfect. And maybe that was better. That evening, she walked home with no box in her arms, just the faint scent of cedar from the boutique clinging to her cardigan. Her apartment felt different when she stepped inside. Not bigger, not brighter, but steadier. Like it had absorbed her own proof that she could say yes to an opportunity and deliver on it. She wrote in her journal, Day 21 wins. Delivered first boutique collection. Met deadline without sacrificing quality. Learned that perfect is less important than finished and true. And under it, one more line, in all caps. This is possible. The first Saturday of December arrived cold and bright. Claire woke to the sound of the radiator clicking in the corner and the faint hum of traffic outside. She lay there for a moment, letting the realization settle in. Today wasn't just another day in her apartment. Today her work would hang in a public space, surrounded by strangers' eyes and hands. She pulled on her thickest sweater, the cream one with the loose sleeves that swallowed her wrists, and tied her hair back into a low knot. No paint smudges today. Today she needed to look like someone who belonged behind a table at a boutique market. The air was sharp as she stepped out of her building, breath clouding in the sunlight. She balanced a tote bag on her shoulder, carrying a few extra prints and the small card stand she decided to bring just in case. Gather was already buzzing when she arrived. A small crowd milled outside, waiting for the doors to open. Inside, the air smelled like cinnamon and pine. Soft music drifted through the space, acoustic guitar over the low murmur of vendors setting up. Her display was near the front, next to a table stacked with hand-poured candles, and across from a shelf of knit scarves and jewel tones. Marissa had already unpacked and arranged her prints, leaning them against wooden stands on a low table. A simple sign read, Watercolor Prints by Claire Moreno, local artist. Seeing her name like that made her stomach flip. The first customers trickled in slowly, a couple holding hands, a mother with 2 young children bundled in puffy coats. Claire stood near her table, unsure whether to greet people or give them space. She'd never been the type to push herself forward. One woman stopped, picking up the eucalyptus wreath print and holding it at arm's length. This is beautiful, she said, glancing at Claire. Did you paint these? Yes, Claire said, her voice softer than she meant. They're all originals I scanned and printed here in the city. The woman smiled and set the print down gently, as though it were fragile. I'll be back, she said, and moved on. Claire let out a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. An hour in, the space had filled. The air carried the hum of overlapping conversations, the clink of mugs from the coffee station in the corner. People leaned over tables, pointed at shelves, and tucked purchases into paper bags. A tall man in a dark peacoat stopped at her table, flipping through the unframed prints she'd stacked in a shallow wooden crate. He pulled out the snowdrop flowers and held them against his chest for a moment. My wife loves these, he said. She's always wanted something for the kitchen wall. He bought it without hesitation, paying in cash. Claire slid the print into a craft envelope and handed it to him, feeling a small rush of warmth. It wasn't just the sale. It was the thought of her work hanging in someone's home, part of their everyday life. By midday, she'd sold 6 prints. The tote bag of extras she'd brought, just in case, was already half empty. Marissa passed by and gave her a small thumbs up. You're doing great, she said over the din. People are responding to the work. That's the hardest part. Claire nodded, the tension in her shoulders loosening a fraction. She'd come here braced for polite smiles and no sales. Instead, she was watching people walk out the door with her art tucked under their arms. In the early afternoon, a young woman with a sketchbook under her arm stopped at the table. She studied each print carefully, lingering over the holly sprigs. Your colors, she said, finally looking up. They're so soft. I always go too bright in my work. You paint? Claire asked. The woman nodded. Still learning. I've never taken a class. I just practice from YouTube videos. Sometimes I wonder if it's even worth it. Claire surprised herself by leaning forward slightly. It is. I started small, too, just painting in the evenings after work. You keep going, and one day you look up and realize you've built something. The woman smiled faintly, almost shyly. I hope so. She bought the holly print and left, but the encounter stayed with Claire. It had been years since she'd thought of herself as someone who could give advice about art. The last rush came just before closing, when the crowd thinned enough for Claire to notice how sore her feet were. She'd been standing most of the day without thinking about it. When the final customer left, Marissa came over, helping her wrap up the remaining prints. You did really well, Marissa said. Better than I expected for a first market. You have a style people connect with, that's rare. Claire packed the last of her things, a strange mix of exhaustion and exhilaration settling over her. Walking home in the early evening, she felt the cold air sting her cheeks. The streets glittered with early holiday lights strung between lampposts. She passed shop windows glowing warm against the dark, the smell of fresh bread drifting from the bakery on the corner. Back in her apartment, she dropped the tote bag by the desk and sat for a moment, letting the quiet return. The market had been noisy, bustling, a kind of energy she hadn't felt in months. Now, in the stillness, she could measure what had happened. She opened her journal, flipping to a clean page, and began writing. Date, 27 wins. Sold 14 prints at Winter Market. Met other local artists. Gave advice to a beginning painter. Saw my work on display, and it belonged there. She underlined that last sentence twice. She made tea and carried it to the window, watching as snow began to fall, light at first, then steadier. The flakes caught in the lamplight like glitter. For the first time since quitting the cafe, she wasn't thinking about whether she'd made a mistake. She was thinking about what came next. The market had shown her something she hadn't realized she needed to see. People didn't just like her work online. They liked it in their hands, in the real world. And that meant she could grow in ways she hadn't considered. Wholesale, consignment, more markets, maybe even her own pop-up someday. She sat down at her desk again, pulling the business binder toward her. On a fresh sheet of paper, she wrote, "New opportunities." Under it, she listed, "Apply for spring artisan markets. Research wholesale pricing structures. Build relationships with at least 3 more local shops." The list was practical, but the feeling behind it wasn't just businesslike. It was hunger. She wanted more days like today, days when she could look someone in the eye as they chose her work to take home. Later, she climbed into bed, the sound of snow still whispering against the window. She thought of the woman with the sketchbook, of the man buying the snowdrops for his wife, of Marissa's quiet confidence. She realized something. The market wasn't just about sales. It was about connection, between her and the people who saw her work, and between her and herself. For weeks, she'd been thinking of herself as someone trying to make a living from art. Tonight, she fell asleep knowing she was an artist. The Monday after the winter market felt unusually still. Claire sat at her desk, tea steaming beside her, the candle from Marissa burning low. The apartment smelled faintly of cedar and vanilla again, a scent that had become almost synonymous with forward motion in her mind. Her tote bag was still on the floor from Saturday, half unpacked. She pulled out the leftover prints, stacking them neatly, running her fingers over the textured paper. The holly sprigs, the snowdrops, the eucalyptus wreath that had been one of her best sellers. Every one of them carried the memory of someone pausing at her table, tilting their head, saying quietly, "I love this." Her phone buzzed, the sound slicing through the quiet. It was an email notification. She glanced at the subject line. Gather, Winter Market follow-up. She clicked it open. Claire, thank you again for participating in our market. We had great feedback on your work. A lot of customers specifically mentioned your prints as a highlight. I have a proposal. We'd like to carry a small, rotating selection of your prints in the shop year-round. Could you come by this week to discuss wholesale pricing and quantities? Best. Marissa. Claire read it twice. Wholesale. Year-round. It was more than she'd imagined happening this quickly. She'd been thinking she might need months of building an audience before any shop would want to carry her work beyond a seasonal market. Her first instinct was to say yes immediately, but then a second thought pushed in. Wholesale meant bulk orders. Bulk orders meant she'd need to be ready to print, package, and deliver a lot more than she'd been producing so far. She looked at her printer, the small but reliable workhorse on her desk, and wondered if it could handle it. That afternoon, she bundled up and walked to Gather. The air was crisp and the sidewalks glittered with a thin dusting of snow. Inside, the shop was quiet, the post-weekend calm settling over the shelves. Marissa greeted her with a hug. "I meant every word in that email," she said, leading Claire toward the counter. "Your table had a pull. People lingered there longer than most. That's rare." Claire felt heat rise in her cheeks. "Thank you. That means a lot." Marissa laid out the terms. She wanted 25 framed prints to start, a mix of the winter designs, and a few florals for the coming spring. She would restock monthly if they sold well. Payment would be half up front, half upon delivery. Claire took notes, her pen moving quickly across the page in her journal. She asked about sizes, frame styles, how the shop preferred to display them. I'll need to adjust my workflow, she admitted. I've only been printing in small batches. Marissa nodded. That's part of the learning curve. If you want, I can connect you with a local print shop. Some of our other artists outsource their printing, so they can focus on creating. It was a generous offer, but Claire felt a tug in the opposite direction. She liked handling every piece herself, from brushstroke to packaging. Still, she knew she'd need to find a balance. Back home, she cleared her desk completely, wiping away flecks of paint and tiny pencil shavings. She pulled out a fresh pad of watercolor paper and wrote across the top sheet in bold marker, "Spring Collection." Under it, she listed daffodils, lavender sprigs, cherry blossom branch, fern fronds, minimalist tulip. She set herself a deadline, 3 weeks to finish all 5 designs: scan, edit, print, frame, and deliver. It was ambitious, but she felt a rush of focus just seeing the list in front of her. The next days became a blur of work. She'd wake before sunrise, make coffee, and paint with the soft morning light spilling over her desk. She learned to move in efficient patterns, letting one layer of watercolor dry while she started the next design, scanning one piece while trimming paper for another. She kept a spreadsheet of costs: paper, ink, frames, packaging. Seeing the numbers add up reminded her that this was more than art now. It was inventory. It was a business. Some nights, she stayed up late editing digital scans, adjusting colors to match the originals exactly. She invested in better lighting for photographing her work, knowing Marissa might feature the prints on Gather's website and social media. 2 weeks in, she hit her first snag. Her printer began leaving faint streaks along the edges of the paper. It wasn't noticeable at first, but once she saw it, she couldn't unsee it. She spent an entire afternoon troubleshooting, cleaning the print heads, running test pages, recalibrating. Nothing worked. By evening, she was sitting cross-legged on the floor, scrolling through printer reviews on her laptop, feeling the pressure of the deadline tightening around her. The next morning, she made the call. She'd outsourced the printing for this order. She carried her files to a local print shop Marissa had mentioned, the kind of place with huge professional machines and racks of freshly printed posters. The owner, a man named Henry with ink-stained fingers, listened carefully as she explained the look and feel she wanted. He handed her a sample sheet from a previous project. The texture was perfect, the colors rich and accurate. "We can match your files to this exactly," he said. Leaving the shop, she felt a strange mix of relief and vulnerability. Letting someone else handle part of her process felt like handing over a piece of herself. But it also freed her to focus on creating, and that was the point. With printing solved, she turned her attention to framing. She'd found a supplier who sold simple, matte black frames in bulk. The first shipment arrived in a long, heavy box that she had to wrestle up the stairs to her apartment. She spent an entire afternoon unboxing them, checking for scratches, cleaning the glass, and fitting each print with careful precision. The repetitive motion became meditative. Slide the print in, secure the tabs, wipe the glass, place in the finished stack. 3 days before the deadline, her apartment looked like a small warehouse. Finished frames lined the wall. Rolls of bubble wrap and stacks of craft paper took up half the couch. Her desk was buried under shipping labels and inventory sheets. She worked late into the night, her playlist humming quietly in the background, the candle flickering beside her. Every finished piece she wrapped felt like another step into a future she hadn't dared to picture a few months ago. Delivery day arrived with a pale winter sun breaking through the clouds. She loaded the framed prints into 2 large boxes, cushioning each with layers of paper. A neighbor helped her carry them down to the street, where she called a rideshare. At Gather, Marissa cleared a table near the window. Together they unpacked the prints, leaning them against the wall, arranging them by color and theme. The cherry blossoms caught the light beautifully, the soft pinks glowing against the dark frames. "These are going to do so well," Marissa said, her voice certain. Claire felt a swell of something that was part pride, part disbelief. On her walk home, the cold air felt almost electric in her lungs. She passed the corner cafe where she used to work, glancing through the window at the early morning customers. It was a different kind of busy in there, steady, predictable. She realized she didn't miss it. She missed the security sometimes, yes, but not enough to trade for what she'd just done. That evening, she sat at her desk, flipping to the back of her journal. She wrote, "Wholesale order number 1, lessons learned. Outsourcing can be a strength, not a weakness. Bulk work needs systems, batching, tracking, deadlines. The feeling of seeing my work in a store doesn't fade." She looked at those last words for a long time. Somewhere along the way, this had stopped feeling like a gamble. It was still hard, still full of unknowns, but it was no longer a question of if she could make it work. It was a matter of how far she could take it. By the end of January, the snow outside had turned to a dull gray slush along the curbs, but inside Gather, Claire's prints still glowed bright against the winter light. Marissa sent her a short text one afternoon. "We're almost sold out. Let's talk restock." Claire smiled at the screen, setting down her tea. It had been just over 3 weeks since she delivered that first wholesale order, and she'd already been asked for more. It was proof that what she'd felt at the winter market wasn't a fluke. People really did want her work, even in the slowest retail month of the year. She packed her messenger bag with her notebook, tablet, and a few sample prints, then walked to the shop. The sidewalks were wet from a morning thaw, the air heavy with the smell of damp stone and distant coffee. When she arrived, Marissa was already at the counter, flipping through a new catalog of handmade goods. "You're selling faster than most of our established artists," Marissa said, motioning for Claire to join her. "I think it's your balance, detailed enough to feel special, simple enough to fit in any home." Claire took the compliment with a small nod, though inside she felt a quiet surge of pride. They set the restock date for mid-February. This time, Marissa suggested doubling the order, 50 framed prints, plus a selection of unframed ones and protective sleeves for lower price point customers. It was a bigger commitment. More materials, more printing, more time. But Claire didn't hesitate. On her walk home, she realized she'd crossed an invisible line. A month ago, she might have worried about whether she could fill an order like this. Now, she was thinking about how to make it happen faster, smoother, better. That night, she sat at her desk, the candle flickering beside her, and opened her laptop to a blank spreadsheet. At the top, she typed, "Wholesale inventory tracker." She listed columns for order date, print name, quantity ordered, quantity delivered, cost per unit, delivery date, notes. It was the kind of organized system she used to associate with real businesses, the one she assumed other people ran. Now it was hers. The next morning, she picked up her second wholesale batch from Henry's print shop. They talked briefly about paper weights and color profiles, and Henry asked whether she'd ever thought of selling to shops outside the city. "I wouldn't know where to start," she admitted. "There's a site called Fair," he said, sliding her receipt across the counter. "It's a wholesale marketplace for independent brands. Shops all over the country browse it. You'd do well there." The name stuck in her mind for the rest of the day. That evening, she looked it up, scrolling through pages of ceramics, textiles, stationery, and, yes, art prints. She saw vendors shipping from California to Maine, their products styled beautifully against clean white backgrounds. It was intimidating, but it was also exactly the kind of reach she'd started to imagine. She spent the next week photographing her prints in bright natural light, styling them with props, a vase of tulips beside the cherry blossoms, a sprig of rosemary next to the lavender sprigs. She ironed the linen cloth she used as a backdrop, learning how the smallest wrinkle could throw off an otherwise perfect shot. Once the photos were ready, she created her profile on Fair. She typed slowly, choosing each word of her bio carefully. Claire Moreno is a watercolor artist based in New York City, specializing in botanical and seasonal prints inspired by the quiet beauty of everyday life. She set her wholesale prices, calculated her minimum order, and uploaded the images. When she finally hit publish, she sat back in her chair, heart racing. The first week brought nothing but a few profile views. But on the 10th day, she woke to an email notification. New order from Willow and Finch Home, Vermont. The shop owner had ordered 20 prints, a mix of her winter and spring designs. Claire stared at the message, then at the shipping address. It was the first time her work would leave the state. She printed the order sheet, double-checked each quantity, and laid the prints out on her desk. Wrapping them felt different this time, not better or worse, but charged with the knowledge that someone hundreds of miles away would unwrap them, display them, and sell them to people she'd never meet. Shipping day was chaotic in a way she secretly loved. She learned how to build sturdy cardboard mailers, where to reinforce the corners, how to mark fragile without smudging the ink. At the post office, she stood in line behind a man mailing a care package overseas and a woman sending a stack of wedding invitations. When she handed the box over the counter, she felt the same strange pride she'd felt at Gather, only magnified. Her work was moving outward now, like ripples in water. Over the next month, more orders came through Fair. A gift shop in Colorado, a small bookstore in Michigan, a coastal boutique in Oregon that wanted 30 prints for their spring launch. Each order brought its own logistics, shipping costs, delivery timelines, inventory updates, but she was finding her rhythm. She batched her printing, framed in assembly line fashion, and set aside one day a week just for packaging and shipping. Her apartment evolved to meet the new demands. The corner where her reading chair used to sit became the shipping station, with stacks of flat mailers, rolls of craft paper, and a label printer she'd bought with her latest profits. The desk still held her paints and brushes, but now half its surface was covered with checklists and order forms. She'd stopped thinking of these changes as intrusions. They were signs of growth. One night, after sealing her last package of the day, she opened her journal and flipped back to the earliest pages, the ones from before the winter market, before Gather, before Fair. The handwriting was smaller there, the entries shorter, the questions heavier. Will anyone buy these? Am I just fooling myself? She smiled faintly at those lines, not in mockery, but in recognition. She could still remember the feeling of not knowing. That uncertainty had been real. But so was this, the stack of outgoing orders by the door, the calendar dotted with shipping dates. In early March, she got an email from Willow and Finch, the Vermont shop that had placed her first out-of-state order. They'd sold through all 20 prints and wanted to double their next order in time for Easter weekend. Reading it, she realized something important. Repeat orders were the key. Selling once was good. Selling again to the same customer meant she'd built trust. She added a new page to her business binder titled Repeat Clients and started tracking every shop that reordered. It became a quiet metric she measured herself by, the percentage of first-time buyers who came back. One Saturday morning, she walked past a small boutique a few neighborhoods away and stopped in her tracks. In the window, displayed between a set of handmade mugs and a stack of linen napkins, was her eucalyptus wreath print. She stepped inside, the bell above the door chiming softly, and let her eyes wander over the shelves. There it was again, the cherry blossoms, hanging above a table of scented candles. She didn't say anything to the shopkeeper about being the artist. She just browsed for a few minutes, bought a small notebook, and left. On the sidewalk outside, she stood for a long moment, the winter wind brushing against her face. By late March, the days were stretching longer, the cold holding on only in the early mornings. Claire noticed it first in the light, how it filled her apartment earlier now, glinting off the jars of brushes on her desk. Her Fair orders had doubled since February. What used to be a trickle, one order every week or so, had become a steady flow. She'd learned to read the patterns. Mondays brought orders from shops catching up after weekend sales. Thursdays often saw a rush from store owners prepping for Friday deliveries. It was more than she could keep up with alone, not without something breaking. The breaking point came on a Tuesday morning when her phone buzzed with a Fair notification. Order number 117, Seaside Home and Garden, Maine, 80 units. 80. She stared at the number, her mind already calculating. Printing in multiple batches. 2 full days of framing. At least a day for packaging. Shipping logistics for a box that big. On top of that, she still had 2 smaller orders in progress. For the first time since she'd started, she felt a knot of worry in her stomach. Not the will they buy, worry from her early days, but a different kind. Can I keep up without burning out? That afternoon, she walked to her neighborhood coffee shop and found her usual window seat. The steam from her latte fogged the glass as she opened her notebook. At the top of the page, she wrote, "To keep growing, I need." Beneath it, she made a list. A part-time assistant for framing and packaging. More storage space for frames and prints. A better system for tracking inventory. A reliable shipping schedule. She stared at the list. For months she'd been telling herself she wasn't big enough, yet for help. But the truth was, she'd crossed that threshold without noticing. 2 days later, she posted a message in a local artist group, looking for a reliable part-time helper for my art business. Framing, packaging, and light inventory work. Flexible hours, ideally in the afternoons. Paid hourly. Within hours, her inbox had replies. One stood out, a woman named Anya, a recent art school graduate looking for part-time income. They met at a small bakery, and Claire liked her immediately. Anya had short black hair tucked under a knit cap, an easy smile, and a way of talking about art that felt genuine. By the end of their coffee, Claire had offered her 10 hours a week. The first day Anya came over, the apartment was already a maze of boxes and stacks of prints. Claire showed her the framing process, how to check each print for dust, how to secure the tabs without bending the backing, how to wipe the glass so no smudges showed. Anya learned fast, and by the second week, she could frame twice as fast as Claire could alone. It was the first time Claire felt the weight of production lift just enough for her to breathe. With help in place, she turned her attention to storage. Right now, her frames arrived in bulk and sat in the middle of her living room until she used them. Her finished prints leaned against the wall in stacks, easy to knock over. One Saturday, she visited a used furniture warehouse and found a set of tall, sturdy shelving units, the kind built for stockrooms. They weren't pretty, but they could hold hundreds of frames and prints without warping. She spent the rest of the weekend reorganizing. Top shelves for frames, middle shelves for wrap prints sorted by design, lower shelves for shipping supplies. When she stepped back, the space felt less like a cramped apartment and more like a functioning studio. With her systems improving, she began to think differently about pricing. For months, she'd been charging what felt safe, wholesale rates that covered her costs and gave her a modest profit. But as she calculated her time, her assistant's wages, and the true cost of materials, she realized she was undervaluing her work. She raised her wholesale price per print by 15%. It was nerve-wracking. She worried shops might balk, but when the next orders came in, no one questioned it. If anything, it made her work feel more premium. Then, in April, she got an email from a store in Chicago. "We'd like to order 150 prints for our Mother's Day gift section." 150. It was triple the size of any order she'd done before. But instead of panic, she felt a quiet readiness. With Anya's help, the shelving system, and Henry's printing turnaround, she could do this. She mapped it out on her calendar. Week 1, printing and framing. Week 2, final assembly, packaging, and quality checks. Shipped by April 28th. The plan worked. On the last Thursday of the month, she and Anya wheeled a dolly stacked with 3 massive boxes into the shipping center. They stood side by side as the clerk weighed each one, printed labels, and slid them onto the conveyor. Claire paid, thanked the clerk, and stepped outside into the warm spring air. She could feel it, the shift from small business to something larger. At home that night, she pulled out her ledger and tallied her revenue from the first 4 months of the year. It was more than she'd made in her first year of selling art. She closed the book, leaned back in her chair, and let the thought settle. She wasn't just keeping up anymore. She was building something sustainable. The next step was visibility. She'd built momentum through Fair and Gather, but she wanted her own channels too, places where customers could find her directly. She launched a simple website with an About page, wholesale inquiry form, and gallery of her designs. She linked it to a new Instagram account where she posted behind-the-scenes photos, Anya wrapping prints, stacks of framed art ready for shipment, her watercolor process, and time-lapse videos. It felt awkward at first, putting herself out there. But as the follower count slowly ticked upward, she began to see it for what it was. Not vanity, but connection. By June, her order volume was steady enough that she and Anya developed a rhythm. Mondays for admin, updating inventory, answering inquiries. Tuesdays and Wednesdays for framing. Thursdays for packaging. Fridays for shipping. Saturdays and Sundays were for painting new designs. The structure kept them moving without burnout. And it gave Claire something she hadn't had since she started, the space to think ahead. One afternoon, she sat by the window with her journal and wrote. Vision for next year. Launch a full seasonal collection, spring, summer, fall, winter. Get featured in at least one national magazine or design blog. Hire a second part-time assistant. Rent a dedicated studio space. She underlined that last one twice. Her apartment had served her well, but the shelves were full, and she'd started storing shipping boxes under her bed. If she wanted to keep growing, she needed room to expand. For now, though, she looked around at what she'd built. The organized shelves, the hum of the label printer, the soft clink of frames being stacked in the corner, and felt a deep, steady satisfaction. Her $4,000 side hustle had turned into something she could live on. And for the first time, she believed it could become much, much more. By the first week of July, the heat in Claire's apartment had become oppressive. Even with the ceiling fan whirring and both windows cracked open, the air felt heavy. She'd spent the morning framing an order for a Chicago gift shop, and the glass panes were warm to the touch by the time she slid them into place. It wasn't just the summer heat. It was the space. Every available surface was occupied. The tall shelving she bought back in March now groaned under the weight of frames, mailers, and finished prints. The kitchen table had been swallowed entirely by stacks of craft paper and rolls of tape. The narrow hallway doubled as a storage lane for flat-pack boxes. It was still home, but it no longer felt like a place to live. It felt like a warehouse with a bed in the corner. That evening, after finishing her last shipment of the day, Claire sat with a glass of iced tea and her journal. On a fresh page, she wrote in block letters, "Studio space." Below it, she made 2 columns. Needs: at least 400 square feet. Good natural light for product photography. Safe for storing inventory. Affordable enough to manage with current revenue. Wants: accessible by public transit. Space for 2 work tables plus shelving. Small kitchen or coffee corner. She closed the book with a quiet decision forming in her mind. It was time. The search began the next morning. She scrolled through online listings, most of which fell into one of 2 categories: beautiful and far too expensive, or affordable but windowless and cramped. She visited 3 spaces in person that week. The first was an airy loft in an old garment building with tall windows and creaky floors, but the rent made her throat tighten. The second was in a basement that smelled faintly of mildew. The third was a former office space with buzzing fluorescent lights and no soul. By Friday, she was tired of scrolling through disappointment. She closed her laptop and decided to take a different approach: walking. She started in her own neighborhood, wandering side streets she rarely had time to explore. She passed a row of small brick buildings, most with shop fronts on the ground floor and residential windows above. A hand-lettered sign in one window caught her eye: "Studio space for lease. Inquire within." She stepped inside. The air was cool, with the faint scent of sawdust and fresh paint. A tall man in paint-splattered jeans emerged from a back room. "You hear about the studio?" he asked. "Yes," she said, trying to sound casual. He led her down a short hallway to a bright, square room with 2 tall windows facing the street. The walls were freshly whitewashed, the hardwood floors sanded smooth. The space wasn't huge, but it was open and uncluttered. "This used to be part of my workshop," he explained. "I split it off when I downsized. Heat and electricity are included. You'd have your own key and 24-hour access." Claire walked slowly across the room, imagining where the shelving could go, where the work tables could stand. The light from the windows was perfect, soft but steady, even in the late afternoon. They sat at a small desk to talk numbers. The rent was higher than her apartment share of expenses, but not out of reach. She did the math in her head. With her current wholesale orders, she could cover it. With projected growth for the holiday season, she could more than cover it. "I'll take it," she said before she could second-guess herself. He smiled and slid a short lease across the desk. 2 days later, she had the key in her hand, a small brass thing that seemed absurdly light for the weight it carried. She stood in the empty room, sunlight pooling across the floor, and let herself imagine what it would look like in a month. The hum of the label printer, Anya's laughter as they wrapped orders, stacks of prints ready for shipping. Moving in took longer than she expected. Every trip from her apartment to the studio felt like a small migration. Framed prints swaddled in blankets, boxes of craft mailers balanced on her hip, jars of brushes rattling in a canvas tote. She bought 2 long folding tables, positioning them in an L shape by the windows. One became the art table: brushes, watercolor pads, and jars of pigment lined neatly at the edge. The other became the packaging station, with tape dispensers, labels, and rolls of twine arranged in shallow bins. The shelving from her apartment found a new home along the back wall, now with room to breathe between rows. On their first day working there, Anya looked around and said, "It feels like a real business now." Claire smiled but didn't answer right away. She knew it had been real for a long time. But she understood what Anya meant, the shift from something squeezed in a borrowed corners to something with its own walls and door. The first big order to leave the studio was a 120 print shipment for a boutique in San Francisco. They worked side by side for 2 days straight, music playing low in the background, the windows open to let in the summer air. When the boxes were finally taped and labeled, Claire stacked them by the door and stood back. The scene was different now, not just because of the space, but because of the scale. It was the kind of order she'd once thought impossible. Now it felt like a natural step. With a new studio came new habits. She started each morning by unlocking the door, setting her bag on the work table, and opening both windows. The street below was busy enough to feel connected, but not so noisy it broke her focus. She kept a small coffee maker in the corner and stocked it with the dark roast she liked best. She hung a corkboard on the wall by her desk and pinned up sketches for new designs alongside order sheets and a calendar. And at the end of each day, she closed the windows, switched off the lights, and locked the door, leaving work behind in a way she'd never been able to in her apartment. One August afternoon, she got a message from a buyer at a national home goods chain. They'd seen her work through Fair and wanted to discuss a seasonal line for their smaller boutique locations. She almost didn't believe it at first, but the email was real, and so was the conference call that followed. They talked about quantities, timelines, and exclusivity. It wasn't a done deal, but the fact that she was having this conversation at all felt like a milestone. That night, she sat in the quiet studio long after Anya had gone, the golden light slanting across the tables. She thought about the cafe, the hiss of the espresso machine, the ache in her feet at the end of a shift. She thought about the $4,000 runway fund she'd once clung to like a lifeline. And she thought about the key now in her pocket, the door it opened, and the space it led to. It wasn't just a studio. It was the first concrete proof that she could build a life on her own terms. By mid-October, the first hints of the season were creeping into the air. The mornings were crisp, the leaves on the sidewalk shifting from green to burnished gold, and the street outside the studio had begun to smell faintly of cinnamon from the bakery down the block. Inside, Claire had switched the playlist from summer acoustic to a softer, more seasonal mix, the kind that made people linger in shops. It wasn't just for mood. She'd read somewhere that music could affect how quickly you worked, and she was willing to test any theory that might help in the weeks ahead. Because the weeks ahead were going to be brutal. Holiday orders weren't like the rest of the year. Stores didn't want a few dozen prints. They wanted hundreds. And they wanted them yesterday. In the first week of October alone, she'd received 220 prints for a Chicago home boutique, 180 prints for a Portland gift store, 300 for a Canadian wholesaler through Fair. And those were just the confirmed ones. Dozens of were-thinking emails were sitting in her inbox, each one a potential avalanche if the buyer clicked yes. Claire knew she couldn't rely on last-minute scrambling this time. She gathered Anya and her newly hired second helper, a quiet, precise man named Leo, around the work table one Monday morning and laid out the plan. "We're going to work in waves," she said, sliding a printed calendar across the table. "Printing on Mondays and Tuesdays, framing on Wednesdays and Thursdays, packaging and shipping on Fridays. No exceptions, no overlap." They nodded, scanning the blocks of color she'd used to mark each phase. "This way," she continued, "we're never bottlenecked. And we're building buffer time in case something goes wrong." Something did go wrong, twice in the first 2 weeks. First, her printer had a mechanical hiccup and started leaving faint streaks across certain color gradients. It took Henry 2 days to fix it, during which she shifted the team to framing and packaging existing stock. Then, one of her frame suppliers emailed to say a shipment would be delayed because of a dockworker strike. Claire spent half a day on the phone, finding an alternate supplier, eventually paying more than she'd budgeted just to keep production moving. But because of the calendar system, neither problem derailed them completely. By the first week of November, the studio was operating like a small factory. The long tables were divided into zones, cutting mats and rulers at one end, clean microfiber cloths and glass cleaner at the other. Prints were stacked in neat towers by design, each separated by sheets of protective paper. Framed pieces leaned in careful rows against the shelving, labeled with bright sticky notes for each destination city. Anya had become the speed champion at framing, her hands moving with quick, sure movements. Leo excelled at packaging, his edges always perfectly squared and taped without a wrinkle. Claire floated between them, checking quality, printing fresh batches, and fielding a non-stop stream of emails from store owners finalizing orders. The volume was staggering. On one Tuesday alone, she printed 420 sheets. By Thursday, they had 36 boxes stacked in the shipping corner, each one marked with black stenciled letters and a bold label that read fragile. She'd learned from last year's mistakes. Every package was double-cushioned, every glass panel taped in an X for reinforcement. It took longer, but it cut damage complaints to nearly zero. Outside the studio, the city was starting to hum with holiday energy. Shop windows bloomed with garlands and fairy lights. The air turned sharper, each gust of wind pulling a swirl of leaves down the block. Inside, the hum was louder, the low buzz of the label printer, the scrape of frames being stacked, the crinkle of craft paper. And beneath it all, a steady rhythm of focus. One afternoon, Claire paused at the window, coffee mug in hand, and realized she could see her own reflection layered over the street outside. She looked different than she had a year ago. Not just more tired, though that was true, but more grounded. Her hands bore tiny paper cuts from packaging, and a faint streak of green paint still marked the edge of her thumbnail from the design she'd finished 2 nights earlier. But her shoulders didn't carry the same uncertainty they once had. This wasn't a fragile experiment anymore. This was a business. By mid-November, the orders peaked. In a single email batch that Monday morning, she confirmed over 1,200 prints for various buyers. She read the number twice, then looked at the shelves, calculating. It would take everything they had to push these out before the Thanksgiving shipping deadlines. So they pushed. The days blurred into each other, printing, framing, wrapping, labeling. Claire began arriving at the studio before sunrise, the street still quiet, unlocking the door with cold, stiffened fingers. She'd start the coffee, turn on the lights, and be halfway through the first stack of prints before Anya arrived. They took lunch in shifts, sometimes eating with one hand while working with the other. The radio played soft holiday instrumentals, just enough to break the silence without distracting them. By the Friday before Thanksgiving, the shipping corner had transformed into a wall of cardboard. Leo called it the fortress and joked about building a door so they could hide inside. That afternoon, the last of the week's boxes rolled onto the courier truck, the driver giving them a small salute before climbing into the cab. Claire closed the studio door and leaned against it, letting the quiet settle over the room. They'd made it through the first wave, but there was no real break. Black Friday would bring another surge. She spent the weekend at home sketching new designs for stores that wanted fresh options for last-minute shoppers. Her fingers cramped from drawing, but she didn't mind. It felt like building momentum, not just keeping up. December came with a rush of cold air and an even faster rush of orders. The studio was now at full capacity every day, the floor space shrinking as stacks of finished work claimed every corner. One snowy morning, as she brushed frost from the studio windows, her phone buzzed with a notification, a record-breaking wholesale order from a New England store that had just expanded to 3 locations. It would mean long nights, maybe even pulling in weekend help, but she didn't hesitate to accept. The last week before Christmas was a marathon. Claire found herself humming the same 4 bars of a carol on loop as she worked, barely noticing she was doing it. She wore her warmest cardigan, a gift from her mother, and kept a thermos of tea within reach. When the final box of the season was taped, labeled, and carried out the door, she let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for weeks. That night, the 3 of them, Claire, Anya, and Leo, stood in the empty studio with paper cups of champagne. They clinked their glasses, the sound soft against the stillness. To survival, Anya said with a grin. To growth, Claire added. They drank, the bubbles sharp and sweet. Later, alone in the quiet, Claire ran her fingers over the edge of the work table. She thought about the cafe again, about the way her days had once been measured in shift hours and tips. Now, her days were measured in shipments, designs, and the quiet satisfaction of seeing her work land in shops across the country. The holiday rush had been exhausting, but it had also been proof she could handle scale. and scale was the bridge to the next level. The first week of January was quiet in a way that felt almost unnatural. After 2 solid months of relentless movement, the constant hum of the printer, the clatter of frames being stacked, the cardboard fortress in the corner, the stillness in the studio was loud. The work tables were bare except for a coffee mug and a single sketchbook. The corkboard that had been overflowing with order sheets now held only a few pin notes, a thank you card from a Portland shop owner, a photograph of a customer's framed print hanging in their living room, and a post-it with a scribbled reminder, "Dream bigger." Most years, January had been the recovery month, the time to catch her breath, clean the brushes, restock supplies. But this year felt different. This year, she wasn't thinking about recovery. She was thinking about leverage. The holiday season had proven her operation could handle scale. Orders in the hundreds were no longer terrifying. They were expected. She had a team that worked well under pressure, systems that kept them from falling apart when things went wrong, and enough cash cushion to invest without holding her breath. So the question wasn't, can I keep doing this? The question was, how do I do it bigger and smarter? One morning, she sat by the studio window with a legal pad and wrote down 3 goals for the year. Rebrand for premium positioning. Double wholesale accounts. Launch a direct-to-consumer subscription line. The rebrand came first. She'd been thinking about it since last summer, when a boutique owner mentioned that her work was affordable for the quality. A compliment, but also a quiet signal that her pricing and branding weren't yet aligned with the higher-end market. If she wanted to move into 7 figures, she needed customers who didn't flinch at higher prices. And for that, her brand had to look and feel like it belonged in that tier. She started with the name. Claire Moreno Art Prints had served her well on Etsy, but it sounded more like a personal project than a design house. After weeks of brainstorming, she settled on Moreno Studio, a name that carried a sense of softness and artistry, but also felt established. She sketched the new logo herself, refining it until the typography felt balanced, then sent it to a designer she'd met through a creative entrepreneurs group for final polishing. The visual overhaul followed. She replaced the craft paper business cards with thick, cotton-textured cards in warm ivory, the logo embossed in a subtle copper foil. Packaging shifted from plain brown to a soft gray with white tissue paper and a satin ribbon, small changes that immediately elevated the feel of each order. The website was next. She hired a photographer to shoot not just her products, but styled scenes that told a story. Prints in sunlit living rooms, on desks with fresh flowers and steaming coffee, in entryways next to baskets of scarves. For weeks, the studio became half art space, half set design workshop. Anya laughed one afternoon as they rearranged a pile of vintage books for the perfect composition. "We're basically doing home decor ads," she said, tying back her hair. "That's exactly the point," Claire replied. "We're selling a feeling, not just paper." But the rebrand wasn't just about appearances. Claire knew she had to tighten her product line to avoid the trap of being everything to everyone. She went through her entire catalog, pulling out designs that hadn't sold well in the past year. Some were sentimental favorites, but she forced herself to be ruthless. If it doesn't move, it doesn't stay, she told herself, sliding the rejected prints into a flat file drawer. She narrowed the collection to 3 core styles. Minimal botanical prints in soft earth tones. Inspirational quote prints with clean typography and muted backgrounds. Seasonal series tied to nature. Winter branches, spring blossoms, summer greenery, autumn leaves. In February, she announced the rebrand with a soft launch to her existing wholesale clients. The email featured photos of the new packaging, a link to the refreshed catalog, and a personal note. "Thank you for growing with me. This next chapter is about bringing you designs that elevate your customers' homes and your shop's story." Responses came back quickly. Several buyers placed new orders immediately, excited to carry the updated line. A few even increased their order sizes, citing the premium look. Claire didn't stop there. She knew that higher value markets meant more than just boutique gift shops. She wanted to be in interior design studios, curated home goods stores, and high-end hotel gift shops. She built a new outreach list, starting with 50 potential accounts in cities known for strong design culture. New York, San Francisco, Seattle, Austin. Each got a personalized packet, a printed mini catalog, 2 sample prints, and a handwritten note explaining how Moreno Studios' designs could fit their clientele. By the end of March, 5 of those leads had turned into regular wholesale clients. The shift in branding also impacted her pricing. She raised retail prices by 25%, framing the increase around the improved materials, exclusive designs, and limited-run series. Wholesale prices followed suit. There was a moment of hesitation before the first new invoice went out, the old fear that higher prices would scare buyers away. But the opposite happened. Not only did most customers accept the change, several commented that the work had been underpriced before. With the rebrand underway, she turned her attention to the second big goal, doubling wholesale accounts. The systems they'd built during the holiday rush gave her confidence that they could handle more volume without sacrificing quality. She and Anya set a goal of adding 5 new accounts per month. Some came through direct outreach, others through fair, and a few through word of mouth. By the start of summer, they had doubled the number of stores carrying Moreno Studio prints. The final piece of the plan, the subscription line, was the most experimental. She envisioned a monthly delivery of a fresh, exclusive print, packaged with a small seasonal extra like a packet of tea or a press flower bookmark. It was a way to reach customers directly without depending entirely on wholesale, and to build recurring revenue. She soft-launched it with her email list in July, offering a discounted, founding subscriber rate for the first 100 signups. The spots sold out in 3 days. By late summer, the rebrand had begun to reshape the business in ways she could feel. The studio no longer looked like a cramped Etsy operation. It looked like a design studio with purpose. The client list was stronger, the margins were healthier, and the work coming out of their space had a consistency and refinement that she'd been chasing for years. She still ended some days with paper cuts on her hands and paint on her nails. But now, those small marks felt like the badge of studio building towards something much bigger than survival. On the last day of August, she stood at the studio window, watching the evening lights soften over the street. A delivery truck rumbled past, and she caught sight of her own logo, Moreno Studio, printed on one of the shipping labels stacked by the door. She thought about the first sale she'd made years ago, a $15 print wrapped at her kitchen table, shipped in an envelope she'd decorated with stickers to make it feel special. Now, hundreds of her prints were moving through the postal system every month, landing in homes she would never see, carrying the quiet, steady work of the life she'd built. The rebrand hadn't just changed how others saw her work. It had changed how she saw herself. The email came in on a Tuesday morning. Claire was halfway through framing a batch of botanical prints when her laptop pinged with a subject line that didn't look like the usual boutique inquiry. Partnership opportunity, Havenwell Interiors. She knew the name immediately. Havenwell was a nationally recognized interior design firm with offices in 5 major cities and a reputation for outfitting everything from high-end hotels to luxury residential projects. Their work had been featured in Architectural Digest and Elle Decor. She wiped her hands on a lint-free cloth before clicking the message. Hello, Claire. We came across your work through a boutique client of ours in Seattle. We believe your prints could align well with our current design portfolio. We're interested in discussing a possible collaboration for several upcoming projects, including one large-scale hotel renovation. Would you be available for a call later this week? Best. Alyssa Jordan, lead designer, Havenwell Interiors. For a few seconds, she just stared at the screen. Her first instinct was to reread it, to make sure she wasn't imagining it. A boutique client in Seattle. That had to be Harvest House, the shop that had doubled their order size after the rebrand. She made a mental note to send them a thank you gift, whether this led anywhere or not. She glanced at the clock, 10:17 a.m., then typed a quick reply, confirming she was available for a Thursday morning call. The next 2 days were a mix of preparation and nerves. She researched Havenwell's past projects, noting their preference for clean, contemporary spaces layered with organic textures. She reviewed her catalog, flagging which designs would fit their aesthetic without compromise. And she rehearsed talking points, not just about the art itself, but about production capacity, customization options, and delivery timelines. This wasn't just about making a sale. This was about proving she could handle a project at a scale that might dwarf anything she'd done before. Thursday arrived with a gray, overcast sky. Claire dressed with more intention than usual, a tailored navy blouse, hair in a loose wave, makeup just enough to look polished on camera. She set her laptop on the cleanest corner of the work table, angled so the wall of framed prints would serve as her backdrop. When the Zoom window opened, Alyssa Jordan appeared, sleek black hair, dark framed glasses, a workspace behind her that looked like it belonged in a design magazine. "Claire, so glad we could connect," Alyssa said warmly. "We've been admiring your work for a while." The conversation flowed easily at first. Alyssa talked about Havenwell's upcoming projects, including a coastal boutique hotel in Maine that was undergoing a top-to-bottom renovation. They wanted artwork that felt organic and place-specific, but still aligned with their modern, curated style. "We're sourcing from a few different artists," Alyssa explained, "but your botanical series and the muted coastal palette in your seasonal prints could be a perfect fit for the guest rooms and common areas." Claire listened carefully, taking notes. She asked questions about size requirements, framing preferences, and the possibility of site-specific commissions. When Alyssa mentioned that the initial order could be in the range of 350 framed pieces, Claire's pulse picked up, but she kept her voice steady. "That's well within our production capabilities," she said. "We've recently completed high-volume holiday orders and have systems in place to maintain consistency and quality at scale." By the end of the 40-minute call, they had agreed on next steps. Claire would send a tailored proposal by Monday, including mock-ups of her existing designs in the hotel's color scheme, plus 2 new concept sketches inspired by the Maine coastline. As she ended the call, Claire sat back in her chair, exhaling slowly. It wasn't a done deal. Not yet. But it was the biggest door that had ever opened in her business. That afternoon, she spread out swatches of muted blues, soft grays, and warm sand tones across the work table. She pulled prints from her existing collection that matched the palette, then began sketching new ideas. Sea grasses bending in the wind, minimalist renderings of weathered driftwood, the soft silhouette of a lighthouse against morning mist. She worked late into the night, the studio lit by the warm glow of the desk lamp, until she had 2 finished sketches she felt proud to present. On Monday morning, she emailed the proposal. It was more than just a PDF. It was a carefully designed document with high-resolution mock-ups, production timelines, and notes on packaging that would ensure the framed pieces arrived hotel-ready. By Wednesday, Alyssa responded, "Claire, we love your vision. Pending final client approval, we'd like to move forward with the full order for the main project, and we'll be in touch about 2 additional properties we think your work would suit." Claire read it twice, then 3 times. It was real. The contract arrived the following week, 350 framed prints, split between 5 designs, plus 20 larger statement pieces for the hotel's public spaces. Delivery in 12 weeks. The payment terms alone made her pause. A deposit that covered materials and labor up front, with the balance due upon delivery. No scrambling for cash flow, no risky out-of-pocket bets. This was what she'd been building toward. The next morning, she called Anya and Leo into the studio early. They gathered around the work table as she laid out the project timeline. "This is bigger than anything we've done before," she said. "It's going to stretch us, but we're ready for it." They reviewed every step, printing schedule, framing workflow, quality control checkpoints, and a plan for bulk shipping to the hotel's receiving dock in Maine. Leo, ever the quiet problem solver, suggested pre-assembling the frame kits so they could move faster when the printed pieces were ready. Anya offered to track progress daily on a large wall chart so they could see exactly where they stood. Claire felt the weight of leadership in that moment, but also the deep satisfaction of having a team that thought like owners. The first 2 weeks of production were steady and methodical. The studio hummed with focus, the walls lined with finished pieces as they accumulated. Claire balanced the hands-on work with client communication, sending Alyssa weekly photo updates that showed the progress and reassured the hotel's design team. Halfway through, Alyssa emailed with a surprise. The client loves the work so much they want to commission 3 exclusive pieces for the lobby. Would you be open to a site visit so you can get a feel for the space? 2 weeks later, Claire was in Maine, stepping into the hotel's partially finished lobby. The space smelled faintly of fresh paint and new wood. Through the tall windows, she could see the Atlantic stretching into a pale winter horizon. She took notes on the room's natural light, the texture of the stone fireplace, the warm brass fixtures. That night, in her hotel room, she sketched until past midnight, abstract impressions of waves, minimalist renderings of coastal flora, a moody seascape that played with negative space. Back in New York, she painted the originals in her studio, each one infused with a quiet, salt-tinged air she'd felt on the main shore. When the full order shipped, Claire watched the courier truck pull away and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't just fulfillment. It was the execution of a vision at scale, the proof that she could step into spaces she once thought were out of reach. 3 weeks later, Alyssa sent professional photos of the installed work. Claire scrolled through them slowly, her prints above guest room headboards, her statement pieces catching morning light in the lobby, her coastal sketches framed in the elevator foyer. It was surreal, seeing her designs in a setting so far from the kitchen table where it all began. That night, she updated the client's page on her website, adding Havenwell Interiors to the list. And for the first time, she allowed herself to say it out loud, to no one in particular. I'm running a design studio. The Havenwell project changed everything. Not just in numbers, though the deposit had brought more stability than any single payment before, but in perception. Her inbox was suddenly different. The subject lines carried weight: potential licensing inquiry, collaboration proposal, custom order for corporate event. Wholesale accounts that had been cautious before were now quick to place orders, often larger than before. Even the subscription line, which she had been nurturing in the background, began to pick up new sign-ups without her pushing it. It was the kind of momentum she dreamed of. But with it came a new problem: the feeling that her hands were in a dozen different places at once. The first sign was subtle. One Tuesday in April, she arrived at the studio to find a stack of unshipped subscription orders still sitting by the door. It wasn't that they'd been forgotten, they just hadn't fit into the week's production flow. Anya gave her an apologetic look. We've been so tied up finishing the boutique orders for Portland and Chicago that the subscription kits fell behind. Claire nodded, setting down her bag. It's fine for now, but we can't let it become a pattern. Those subscribers are expecting us every month without fail. She could hear the old version of herself, the one who had packed orders at her kitchen table until 2 a.m., insisting she just do it herself. But that wasn't sustainable anymore. The second sign was louder. 2 weeks later, Leo brought over a framed print with a tiny misalignment, barely noticeable to anyone but them. I caught it before it shipped, he said. But if we keep rushing, more of these are going to slip through. Claire studied the piece. The flaw was small, yes, but it was enough to remind her of something she'd been trying to ignore. Growth without structure could undo everything she'd built. That night, she stayed late after the others left, walking the length of the studio in slow loops. She thought about the systems they'd put in place during the holidays, how they'd carried them through the rebrand and into the Havenwell project. But those systems had been built for the scale they were at back then, not for this. The pace now was different. The stakes were higher. If she didn't make changes, she wouldn't just burn herself out. She might start breaking the trust she'd worked years to earn. She started with a whiteboard. At the top, she wrote in neat block letters, "Where we are versus where we need to be." Under "Where we are," she listed the current revenue streams: wholesale, boutiques, interior design firms, subscription line, direct online orders, special commissions. Under "Where we need to be," she added, consistent fulfillment timelines across all channels, defined roles for each team member, dedicated time for creative work that wasn't swallowed by admin tasks. The next morning, she called a meeting. "Here's the thing," she told Anya and Leo. "We're not just a scrappy studio anymore. We're a business with clients who expect consistency at a higher level, and we need to act like it." She proposed a new workflow. Wholesale orders would be batched and handled on specific days of the week. Subscription kits would have a dedicated 2-day production window each month, and custom commissions would be scheduled only if they fit into the existing capacity. Anya looked relieved. "Honestly, having a set rhythm will make it easier to plan ahead." Leo nodded. "And we'll catch mistakes earlier if we're not juggling everything at once." With the schedule in place, Claire tackled the next challenge: hiring. It was the one thing she'd resisted for months. The idea of bringing in another person felt risky, like committing to a responsibility she wasn't sure she could sustain. But the math was simple. They needed another set of hands, and the revenue could support it. She posted a listing for a part-time studio assistant, someone organized, comfortable with production work, and willing to jump in wherever needed. 2 weeks later, they welcomed Marisol, a recent art school graduate with an easy smile and a knack for precision. She started by handling packaging and shipping, freeing up Anya and Leo to focus on production and quality control. The effect was immediate. Subscription kits went out on time. Wholesale orders were prepped ahead of schedule. And for the first time in months, Claire found herself with actual blocks of uninterrupted time for design work. It was in those hours that she began sketching a new series, bold botanical silhouettes layered over abstract watercolor washes. It felt fresh, a departure from her softer, minimalist pieces, and she couldn't wait to see how it would be received. Even with the improvements, the learning curve wasn't smooth. One Friday, a wholesale order for a shop in Denver almost shipped without the correct labeling, a detail that could have led to a costly return. Marisol caught it at the last minute, and though the problem was avoided, Claire felt the jolt of realization. Systems were only as strong as the people running them, and everyone needed to be trained to spot potential issues before they became real ones. She began holding short weekly check-ins, not just to track progress, but to talk through what was working and what wasn't. By early summer, the changes were paying off. Their wholesale accounts were growing steadily. The subscription line had a 95% retention rate, and they were starting to get inquiries from corporate clients, offices and event planners looking for bulk orders of framed prints as gifts. But the biggest one wasn't in the numbers. It was in the way the studio felt. The frantic energy of constant reaction had been replaced with a calmer rhythm. Orders still came in fast, deadlines still mattered, but the work no longer felt like it was teetering on the edge of chaos. One afternoon in July, Claire stood by the studio window, watching a delivery truck pull away. The last of the month's subscription boxes had just gone out, each one packed with care and the small extra she'd chosen for summer, a handmade bookmark pressed with lavender. She thought about the customers who would open those boxes in a few days, who would unwrap the tissue paper and find not just art, but a little piece of the world she'd built. And she realized something important. Growth wasn't just about chasing the next big contract or adding another revenue stream. It was about building a foundation strong enough to hold whatever came next. The foundation wasn't perfect yet, and maybe it never would be. But it was strong enough now to give her the one thing she hadn't had in years, the space to imagine. The email came late on a Monday evening, long after the studio lights had dimmed and the others had gone home. Claire was still at her desk, catching up on invoices, when the subject line caught her eye. Licensing opportunity, Artemis Home. She knew the name. Artemis wasn't just another home goods brand. They were a major national retailer with a reputation for clean, modern lines and seasonal collections that always seemed to sell out. Their ceramics were in half the design blogs she followed, and their textiles had shown up in nearly every styled interior photo on Pinterest for the past year. She clicked it open, heart rate ticking upward. Hello, Claire. We've been following your work for some time and are impressed by the cohesion of your brand and the adaptability of your designs. We believe there is an opportunity for collaboration in our upcoming spring collection, specifically through a licensing arrangement for a series of botanical and abstract pieces. The scope would involve granting Artemis Home the rights to reproduce a selection of your artwork on framed prints, textiles, and limited edition journals. The products would be sold both in-store and online, nationwide. We'd love to set up a call later this week to discuss further. Best. Rachel Myers, Product Development Lead. Artemis Home. Claire leaned back in her chair, staring at the words. This wasn't just a single wholesale order. This was a chance to have her designs in hundreds of stores across the country, in front of an audience far beyond what she could reach on her own. And yet, it was licensing, which meant handing over reproduction rights for a set period of time, which meant, in some ways, letting go of control. She'd read enough in her late-night research binges to know licensing could be both a blessing and a trap. Done well, it could bring in steady revenue and expand her audience. Done poorly, it could dilute the brand she'd worked so carefully to build. She thought about her first wholesale order years ago, the thrill of seeing her prints in a local shop window. This was that, but on a scale she could barely picture. The next morning, she brought it up during the team's check-in. I got an email from Artemis Home, she said, watching Anya's eyebrows lift. They're interested in licensing a set of my designs for their spring line. Leo looked impressed. That's huge. Like, national exposure huge. Marisol tilted her head. But doesn't licensing mean they could use your work in ways you might not control? Claire nodded. Exactly. That's the part one need to think through. She spent the next 2 days gathering as much information as she could. She spoke with a licensing consultant recommended by another artist, read case studies of similar collaborations, and pored over sample contracts. One theme kept coming up: clarity. Clarity about exactly how the artwork could be used. Clarity about how long the license would last. Clarity about compensation, whether it was a flat fee, royalties, or a hybrid. Without that clarity, even the biggest opportunity could turn sour. By Thursday, she felt ready for the call. Rachel from Artemis was warm and professional, her tone carrying both excitement and precision. She explained that they envisioned using Claire's designs in 3 product categories: framed prints, throw pillows, and limited run journals. We'd want exclusive rights for these designs in the home goods category for 18 months, Rachel said. After that, rights would revert to you. Claire listened closely, jotting notes. And in terms of compensation, how do you typically structure licensing agreements? We offer an advance against royalties, Rachel explained. So you'd receive an upfront payment, and then ongoing royalties based on units sold. We provide quarterly sales reports so you can track performance. When the call ended, Claire sat for a long time without moving. An advance would provide immediate cash flow. Royalties could turn into a steady stream of income if the collection sold well. But the exclusivity clause meant she couldn't sell those designs or anything too similar in her own shop for the duration of the agreement. It wasn't a small decision. That night, she opened her journal and wrote 2 columns: reasons to say yes and reasons to say no. Under yes, national exposure to an audience that might never find her otherwise. Passive income potential from royalties. Credibility of partnering with a major brand. Chance to see her work on products she couldn't manufacture herself. Under no, loss of control over how the designs were presented. Risk of brand dilution if quality didn't meet her standards. Exclusivity could limit her own product range for over a year. She stared at the lists, then closed the notebook. She needed one more perspective, someone who'd been there. She reached out to an illustrator she'd met at a design conference the year before, who had done multiple licensing deals. Over coffee at a quiet cafe, the illustrator shared her own experience. The key, she said, stirring her drink, is to think of it like a partnership, not a handover. You set boundaries in the contract, approvals for proofs, veto power if something feels off-brand, and make sure they invest in marketing the collaboration. That's how you get the exposure you're imagining. Claire nodded, feeling a flicker of clarity. It wasn't about saying yes or no. It was about shaping the yes into something that would work for her. The following week, Claire sent Artemis a counterproposal. She agreed to the 3 product categories but added clauses for final approval on all product mock-ups before production, minimum quality standards for materials and printing, an exclusivity window reduced to 12 months instead of 18, a slightly higher royalty percentage. It was a risk they could walk away, but if they stayed, it would be on terms she could live with. 2 days later, Rachel called. We reviewed your notes, she said, and we're happy to move forward with the adjustments. I think this will be a really exciting partnership. Claire felt the knot in her chest loosen. She had said yes, but on her terms. When the contract was signed, the real work began. She selected 5 designs from her catalog, then spent 2 weeks creating 3 brand new pieces just for Artemis. Each one balanced her signature botanical detail with bold shapes and colors that would translate well across multiple products. The first time she saw the prototypes, a pillow with soft watercolor leaves spilling across one corner, a journal with a gold-embossed abstract bloom, she felt a rush of pride. It was her work, her vision, just multiplied. As the spring launch approached, Artemis sent her a marketing calendar, social media campaigns, email features, even a short behind-the-scenes video they wanted to film in her studio. When the collection finally went live, her inbox exploded. Customers she'd never heard from before sent photos of her designs in their living rooms, on their desks, wrapped in ribbon as gifts. Sales for her own shop ticked up too, proof that the exposure was feeding both sides of the business. One evening, months into the launch, Claire sat in the quiet studio, running her fingers over the corner of one of the Artemis journals. It wasn't just about the revenue. though the royalties were already surpassing projections. It was about learning to scale her impact without losing her voice. She thought back to the early days, when the idea of giving up any control over her art felt impossible. Now she understood something she couldn't have back then. Sometimes, growth means letting your work live in the world without you holding it so tightly. The Artemis collection had been live for only 6 weeks, but the ripple effects felt massive. Her inbox was no longer the quiet, predictable trickle it had been a year ago. Now it was a current, steady and insistent, carrying with it collaboration requests, media inquiries, and wholesale applications from cities she'd never even visited. At first, Claire felt the rush. Every new email was proof that her work mattered, that it resonated beyond the walls of her studio. But there was something else brewing underneath, a quiet unease she couldn't quite name. The first time she noticed it, she was scrolling through Instagram late one night. Her designs, the ones licensed to Artemis, were everywhere. Photos from customers, stylists, bloggers. Most of it was beautiful, styled with warm light and fresh flowers, but some of it wasn't. One image showed a pillow from the collection tossed haphazardly on a sagging couch, under harsh fluorescent lighting. Another had one of her framed prints photographed at such a low resolution it blurred the edges she had so carefully painted. She reminded herself that this was the nature of wide release. Once the work was in the world, it would live in contexts she couldn't control. But still, she felt the sting. Her brand had always been curated. Every photo, every product shot, every packaging detail designed to evoke a certain feeling. Now, part of her work was living in a world she hadn't prepared it for. The second sign came from closer to home. A longtime wholesale partner, a small, independent shop in Brooklyn, sent her a short email. "Claire, we love the new collection, but some of our customers are asking why they can find similar designs at Artemis. We're not sure how to position your originals against the national release." She stared at the message for a long time. This was the problem she'd feared, that the intimacy and exclusivity her early supporters valued might feel diminished in the shadow of national exposure. By the end of that week, she knew she had to act. She called a team meeting on Friday morning, the kind where coffee cups steamed on every desk and notepads were already open. "We need to talk about what happens next," she began. "The Artemis partnership is working, but it's also changing the way people see us. We need to make sure we don't lose what made our work special in the first place." Anya leaned forward. "You mean the handmade feel? The personal connection?" "Exactly," Claire said. "We have to protect that, even as we grow." The discussion that followed was long and messy, full of ideas, counterpoints, and practical concerns. Leo suggested doubling down on limited editions, pieces only available directly through the studio, signed and numbered. Anya proposed hosting open studio days where customers could see the process in person. Marisol floated the idea of a quarterly newsletter with behind-the-scenes stories, something to remind people there were real hands and hearts behind every piece. By the end, they had a short list of action steps. Launch a signature series available only in the studio shop. No licensing. No wholesale. Add handwritten notes to all direct orders, even as volume grew. Begin documenting the making process in photos and short videos to share online. The signature series became Claire's personal project. She set aside 3 afternoons a week for it, shutting out email, silencing her phone, and letting herself work in the same quiet, deliberate way she had when it was just her at the kitchen table. The pieces were more intricate than her mass-market designs, layered watercolors, hand-inked details, subtle textures that didn't translate in reproduction. Each one was signed, dated, and packaged with a certificate of authenticity. When they launched the first drop, just 25 pieces, they sold out in under 2 hours. The open studio days were equally successful. The first Saturday they tried it, a line formed outside before the doors even opened. Customers wandered between workstations, watching Anya print and frame, Leo trim and mount, Marisol wrap and label. Claire floated between conversations, answering questions, telling the origin stories of certain designs. People lingered for hours, and many left with both a purchase and a deeper connection to the brand. One woman told her, "I've seen your work online for years, but it's different seeing where it's made. Now every time I look at it, I'll picture this place." Still, balancing both worlds wasn't easy. The Artemis royalties were strong, But managing the relationship took time, approving mock-ups, reviewing marketing materials, making sure the brand alignment stayed intact. The studio's own sales had rebounded after the initial drop in exclusivity, but the increased volume meant more moving parts to manage. Claire found herself constantly switching hats: artist, creative director, operations manager, brand guardian. Some nights, she left the studio with her mind buzzing and her hands aching, unsure if she'd moved the needle forward or just kept the wheels from spinning off. One evening, after a particularly long week, she walked down to the East River, the city lights shimmering across the dark water. She leaned on the railing, letting the cool air hit her face, and thought about everything she'd built. The kitchen table days seemed far away now, and yet they were still the foundation. She realized the heart of her business wasn't a product or a partnership. It was the way she approached the work, with care, with intention, with the belief that art could be both beautiful and personal. If she could hold on to that, in every decision, every collaboration, every piece, she could grow without losing herself. The next morning, she wrote 3 words on the whiteboard in the studio: care, intention, connection. It became their filter. Every new opportunity had to pass through it. Every product, every marketing idea, every business decision. If it didn't strengthen at least one of those pillars, they let it go. It wasn't the fastest way to scale, but it was the way she could live with. By the end of summer, the tension between exposure and intimacy had softened into something sustainable. The Artemis collection was still selling well, but the signature series had grown into its own force, with customers waiting eagerly for each new drop. Wholesale partners began telling her they appreciated the way she'd handled the transition, making sure there were still unique offerings just for them. And the open studio days became a tradition, held the first Saturday of every month, each one as full and lively as the first. One evening, after the last customer had left and the lights were dimmed, Claire sat at her work table, a half-finished watercolor in front of her. She thought about the years ahead, not in terms of sales targets or market share, but in moments like this, quiet, grounded, fully present in the work. The business could grow. The partnerships could expand. But this, the making, the heart of it, would stay hers. It began with a dull ache in her right wrist. Nothing alarming, just the kind of soreness she sometimes felt after a long day of painting and packaging orders. She shrugged it off, assuming a night's rest would fix it. But by the following week, the ache had turned into something sharper, radiating from her wrist up into her forearm. Every time she gripped a paintbrush, there was a twinge. Every time she lifted a stack of prints, a warning. She tried ice packs, stretching, even switching to her non-dominant hand for some tasks. But the pain didn't ease. One Thursday morning, she was midway through hand-inking the details on a new signature series piece when a sudden spasm made her drop the pen. The fine nib left a blot of ink in the center of the design, a ruin she couldn't undo. She sat there staring at the paper, heart sinking. This wasn't just an inconvenience. If she couldn't use her right hand without pain, how could she keep up with the work? At the clinic, the doctor listened carefully, examined her wrist, and delivered the verdict: tendinitis, likely from repetitive strain. You need to rest it, he said firmly. Not just a few hours here and there. I mean real rest. Weeks, maybe months. No heavy lifting, no long painting sessions, no straining movements. If you push through, you risk a more serious injury. Claire sat there in the sterile white room, her mind already racing through deadlines, customer orders, licensing deliverables. That's not really an option, she said. He met her gaze. If you want to keep using your hand long-term, it is. That night, she walked home slowly, the city a blur of neon and headlights. She thought about the promises she'd made, to Artemis, to her customers, to herself. She thought about the people counting on her, her small team, her wholesale partners, the customers who were waiting for the next signature series drop. And for the first time in years, she wondered if she could actually deliver. The next morning, she gathered the team in the studio. I have to tell you something, she began, feeling the weight of the words. I've been diagnosed with tendinitis in my right wrist. The doctor says I need to rest it completely for several weeks. Anya frowned. That means no painting? Claire nodded. No painting. No framing. No lifting stacks of paper. I can do computer work for short stretches, but even that has to be limited. Leo leaned back in his chair, arms crossed. So what's the plan? Do we slow everything down? Claire hesitated. I don't want to stop, but I can't do the physical work right now, which means I'll need to hand off more than I ever have before. It was harder than she expected, not just physically stepping back from the work, but emotionally letting go. She had built this business with her own 2 hands, literally. Every piece, every package, every tiny quality control check had passed through her fingers. Now she had to trust other people to carry that. Over the next week, they rearranged responsibilities. Anya took over hand inking on certain designs, carefully mimicking Claire's line work. Marisol learned the packaging process step by step, from folding tissue paper to sealing boxes. Leo handled more of the photography and product uploads. Claire shifted her focus to strategy and communication. She managed social media updates, wrote the next newsletter, and worked on ideas for future collections, things she could do in short bursts without aggravating her wrist. It wasn't the same, but it kept the wheels turning. The first signature series release, without her full involvement, was nerve-wracking. Claire watched from the corner of the studio as Anya signed her name, Claire's name, on the finished pieces. They had agreed it was the best way to maintain continuity for collectors, but it still felt strange, like watching someone else wear her coat. When the drop went live, it sold out in under 3 hours. The feedback was as positive as ever. You've built something that can survive without you doing every single piece, Leo told her that night. That's not a loss. That's growth. Still, the downtime forced her to face something she'd been avoiding. The fact that the business had become entirely dependent on her hands. If she was ever going to step away, for a week, a month, or a health emergency, it needed to be built in a way that could stand without her physically producing every item. She began sketching out new systems, training guides for every process, from painting prep to shipping, a design library of patterns and templates that others could reproduce under her supervision. More partnerships, like the Artemis deal, that leveraged her creative vision without requiring her to make every unit herself. As the weeks passed, the pain in her wrist slowly eased. She started doing gentle stretches, short painting sessions of 10 minutes, then 20. The first time she completed a full piece again, she felt a rush of gratitude, not just for the physical ability, but for the perspective the injury had forced on her. She realized the business she was building wasn't meant to keep her chained to the desk or easel. It was meant to give her freedom to create when she wanted, to rest when she needed, to live beyond the next order. By the end of the season, she was back to full strength. But the systems they'd put in place stayed. The team was stronger, more capable, and more confident than before. And Claire was no longer afraid of what would happen if she had to step away. Because now she knew the work could wait. The vision could carry on. By early autumn, Claire's wrist had healed, the signature series was thriving, and the Artemis collaboration was entering its final quarter. Life in the studio had a rhythm again, quieter than the frenzy of spring, but steady, deliberate, productive. Which was why the email from Meridian Living landed like a stone in still water. The subject line read, Collaboration Proposal, Meridian Living, Winter Collection. She knew the name immediately. Meridian was a lifestyle brand that seemed to be everywhere, on home decor shelves, in glossy magazine spreads, in curated pop-up shops that made you want to move in. Their aesthetic leaned into earthy neutrals and clean lines, with just enough texture to feel warm instead of stark. The email was from their creative director, Lydia Tran. Claire, we've admired your work for some time, particularly your botanical watercolors and abstract line art. For our upcoming winter collection, we are seeking to license a set of original designs for use on a series of wool throws, ceramic mugs, and art calendars. Our distribution covers both high-end retailers and direct-to-consumer channels. This would be a non-exclusive licensing arrangement, with the option to renew after 1 year. Would you be open to a conversation? Best. Lydia Tran. Non-exclusive. That was the first thing Claire noticed. It meant she could continue to sell the same designs in her own shop, on her own products, even while Meridian sold them in theirs. It was different from Artemis, a softer kind of commitment, but it was still licensing, and she still remembered the delicate balancing act it had taken to protect her brand the first time around. At the next team meeting, she laid the email on the table. What do you think? She asked. Leo whistled low. That's a huge brand. They could put you in front of an audience that Artemis didn't touch. Marisol leaned forward. Non-exclusive is nice. But, are we ready to take on another big partner? We're still riding the Artemis wave. Anya tilted her head. It could be good for the winter season. Different vibe, different products. But I worry about brand fatigue. People seeing your designs everywhere and thinking they're mass market. Claire listened, scribbling notes. She had learned by now that opportunities didn't just expand your business, they reshaped it. Every big yes came with ripples she couldn't always predict. That night, she sat in the quiet of her apartment, journal open, pen tapping against the page. She made 2 lists again, what we'd gain and what we'd risk. Gains. Another revenue stream to diversify income. Exposure to an audience outside Artemis's reach. Chance to expand into new product categories without manufacturing them herself. Risks. Overexposure of certain designs. Time and mental energy needed to manage another corporate relationship. Potential for customers to see her work as less special if it was too widely available. The next day, she scheduled a call with Lydia. Lydia's voice was warm and precise, like someone used to moving big projects forward without making them feel rushed. She explained that Meridian's winter line would focus on cozy minimalism, soft textures, muted palettes, organic motifs. We'd love for your work to be a key part of that, Lydia said. And because the license is non-exclusive, you retain the freedom to use the designs elsewhere. We see this as a collaboration, not an ownership transfer. Claire asked about product quality, manufacturing processes, marketing plans. Lydia had detailed answers for each. When they hung up, Claire felt the familiar pull of possibility, but also the weight of responsibility. She decided to test the idea with her audience. In the next newsletter, she shared a behind-the-scenes look at how licensing worked, without naming Meridian. She explained the pros and cons, asked for feedback, and invited subscribers to share their thoughts on seeing her designs on products in larger retail settings. The replies poured in. Most were enthusiastic, excited about the idea of finding her work in more places. But a small, vocal group expressed hesitation, worried it would change the personal, handmade feel they loved. Claire read every message. She knew she couldn't please everyone, but she also knew she had to make a choice she could stand behind, long after the launch hype faded. The following week, she met with the team again. I think we can do this, she said, but only if we keep the collaboration tight. That means choosing designs that fit Meridian's winter aesthetic, but don't overlap too much with what we sell directly. And I want creative control on product presentation, colors, placement, styling. Anya nodded. So it's like a side branch of the brand, not the whole tree. Exactly, Claire said. It's an expansion, not a replacement. They signed the deal in early November. Claire chose 3 designs for Meridian, a delicate line drawing of winter branches, a muted watercolor of eucalyptus leaves, and an abstract composition in shades of cream, taupe, and charcoal. Over the next month, she worked closely with Meridian's product team, tweaking the shade of glaze on the mugs, adjusting the texture of the wool for the throws. She insisted on seeing physical samples before approving anything. When the products launched in late January, they were everywhere, styled in winter cabin scenes on Instagram, featured in a spread in Modern Living, even photographed in a snowy mountain lodge for an online travel magazine. The throws, in particular, became a hit. Customers posted photos of themselves wrapped in them, mugs in hand, a calendar hanging in the background. Claire noticed something interesting. Instead of cannibalizing her own sales, the Meridian products seemed to bring new customers to her shop. People who discovered her through the throws came looking for the signature series. One evening, after the rush of the winter launch had settled, Claire sat in the studio surrounded by samples from both Artemis and Meridian. She realized something. This was what scaling on her terms looked like. Not chasing every opportunity, but choosing partnerships that aligned with her values, protected her brand, and expanded her reach without erasing the intimacy she had worked so hard to create. She thought about the early days, when growth had seemed like a far-off dream. Now, she understood that real growth wasn't just about getting bigger. It was about getting stronger, smarter, more intentional. February in New York carried a kind of cold that pressed through every layer of clothing, a chill that seemed to slow the city's pulse without dimming its noise. Inside Claire's studio, however, the air was warm, a mix of sunlight from tall industrial windows and the faint scent of paper and ink. The Signature series had just released its winter drop. Artemis was gearing up for the spring marketing push. Meridian's winter collection was still riding high. On paper, things looked better than they ever had. But something in her felt thin. She realized it one afternoon when she was alone in the studio, the team out for lunch. Her desk was covered in samples and invoices, but in the corner sat an untouched stack of cold-pressed watercolor paper, the kind she used for her earliest, most intimate work. She hadn't made something purely for herself in months, maybe longer. Every brushstroke lately had been tied to a deadline, a deliverable, a contract. She missed the days when a piece could evolve for no reason other than that she felt like seeing where it went. That night, she pulled one sheet from the stack, taped it to her table, and began painting without a plan. No mood board, no target market, just the weight of the brush in her hand, the sound of water moving across paper, the subtle bloom of pigment spreading into wet space. It felt like breathing after holding her lungs still for too long. The next morning, she kept going. And the morning after that. Within a week, she had 6 new pieces. Within a month, she had nearly 20. They didn't match the clean minimalism of the Meridian line or the crisp market-ready style of Artemis. These were looser, more layered, almost dreamlike, a blend of botanical motifs and abstract washes that shifted depending on the light. When Anya came in and saw them spread across the table, she stopped mid-step. "These are different," she said. "In a good way. What are they for?" Claire hesitated. "I don't know yet. Maybe nothing." Anya smiled. "I think they're for you." Still, the practical part of her brain started asking questions. If she put time into this, what would it mean for the rest of the schedule? Could she fit it between the obligations of 2 major licensing deals and the ongoing Signature series drops? The answer, she decided, was yes, but only if she made it a protected project. She blocked off 2 mornings a week, no email, no meetings, no production work. Just this. It wasn't easy to keep those hours sacred. Artemis wanted her approval on a new advertising layout. Meridian's product team had urgent questions about color matching a new glaze. Wholesale partners needed reorders processed. But every time she felt herself being pulled toward the noise, she remembered how the painting felt, like walking into a quiet room after a long, crowded evening. One rainy Thursday, she was deep into a piece when Leo walked in early. He watched her work for a moment, then said, "These feel like they belong somewhere bigger than a single drop." Claire kept painting. Bigger how? A show, a gallery, or maybe a book. Something that doesn't just sell them, something that tells a story behind them. The idea landed in her chest like a small, bright weight. A show. She'd thought about it before, but it had always felt too risky, too far from the safety of product-based sales. Still, she couldn't ignore the pull. Over the next week, she began quietly researching local gallery spaces. Some were too small, others too commercial, but she found one in Brooklyn that made her stop scrolling. High ceilings, whitewashed brick, natural light pouring through skylights. The kind of space where art didn't just hang, it breathed. She reached out to the curator, sending a small portfolio of the new pieces. 2 days later, the reply came, "Let's talk." The meeting was set for early March. She told the team, "This is just an exploratory conversation. I'm not committing yet." But inside, she already felt the shape of it forming. An exhibition that wasn't about products or partnerships, but about the journey that had brought her here. Balancing it all was another matter entirely. The Artemis Spring Push meant approving promotional images, recording a short video for their social channels, and reviewing store display mock-ups. Meridian was in the early stages of designing a fall line, which meant mood board reviews, sample evaluations, and strategic planning calls. And the Signature series never stopped. The next release was already in production. The studio calendar looked like a puzzle where every piece was labeled urgent. Some days, the weight of it felt like too much. But then she'd open her studio early, the city still quiet, and step into those protected hours with her brush in hand. The noise would fade, replaced by the steady rhythm of water, pigment, and paper. It reminded her why she had built this life in the first place. Not for the deals, the numbers, or even the audience, but for the work itself. When the curator meeting came, she brought 10 finished pieces in a flat portfolio. The gallery was even more beautiful in person, airy, light, and open. The curator, a woman named Sloane, walked slowly around each painting, taking them in without speaking. When she finally looked up, she said, "These are alive. They're not just images, they're moments." Claire felt a knot and her chest loosen. "I'd like to offer you a show in early autumn," Sloane continued. "Solo exhibition. We'll feature 15 to 20 pieces. You can choose how much context you want to give, whether to include your story alongside them, or let the work speak for itself." Claire's pulse quickened. This was real now. That night, she walked back through the city with the wind cutting sharp and clean against her face. It would mean even more to juggle. It would mean saying no to some things, possibly even delaying others. But it also felt like the truest yes she'd said in a long time. She told the team the next morning, "This is going to be a lot," she admitted. "And I know it's not directly tied to our existing revenue streams. But I think it's important. It's about who we are as a brand, and who I am as an artist." Anya grinned. "We're in," Leo added. "We'll make it work. We always do." From that point on, the exhibition became the quiet center of everything else. Part of the work was creating, finishing the pieces, framing them, deciding on the sequence. Part of it was telling the story, finding the right words for the show's catalog, deciding how much of her personal journey to share. But most of it was holding space for the project in a life that was already full to its edges. And somehow, she did. The exhibition was set for a crisp October evening. By the time the sun dipped low over Brooklyn, the gallery's tall windows glowed from within, each pane catching the warmth of the lights inside. Claire arrived an hour early. Not because she needed to. The team and the gallery staff had already set everything perfectly, but because she wanted to stand in the space before the noise began. 15 pieces hung on whitewashed brick, each framed in pale oak. The layout was deliberate, starting with smaller, more delicate works and moving toward the large, layered composition she had completed just weeks ago. Between some of the paintings, a short paragraph was mounted, pieces of her story. Not the full business arc, not the numbers, but the quiet truths. How she'd begun selling art to pay rent, how she'd nearly burned out under the weight of her own success, how the act of making had saved her more than once. At the far wall hung the piece she'd chosen as the anchor, a sweeping wash of muted greens and grays, with fine ink lines tracing through it like branches in winter. It didn't have a name. She didn't think it needed one. She walked the room slowly, hearing the faint hum of the city outside. The air smelled faintly of sawdust from the fresh frames. Her shoes echoed softly on the polished concrete. For months, this night had been an endpoint she was working toward, but now it felt like something else entirely. Not an ending. Not even a peak. More like an opening. Anya was the first to arrive, wearing a deep navy dress and carrying a small leather notebook. "Guest book," she said, holding it up. "Thought people might want to leave more than just their name." Leo followed, camera in hand, snapping test shots before the crowd arrived. Marisol, in a marigold scarf, set out trays of champagne flutes. "This is your night," Marisol said, handing her a glass of sparkling water. "You're not allowed to refill drinks or rearrange frames. Just be here." Claire smiled. "I'll try." The first guest came right at opening, a mix of friends, longtime customers, and a few curious gallery regulars. Claire greeted each one, but kept drifting back toward the walls, watching from a slight distance as people engaged with the work. She noticed how they leaned in close to see the fine ink details, how they stepped back to take in the full sweep of color, how they sometimes just stood still, hands in pockets, head tilted slightly, breathing with the piece. It was a strange and humbling thing to see something she had made alone in a quiet studio now living in the minds of strangers. Half an hour in, Sloane, the curator, slipped to her side. "They're responding," she said quietly. "Not just to the beauty of the work, but to the way it's presented. The bits of story help them understand the thread running through it all." Claire nodded. She had worried about that, about whether sharing those fragments would make the show too personal. But maybe that was the point. A familiar face appeared in the crowd, Lydia from Meridian. She made her way over, admiring the large anchor piece. "These are extraordinary in person," Lydia said, "and different from the work we've done together, freer. You should be proud." Next came someone from Artemis's marketing team, who whispered to Claire, "We might need to talk about a special edition print run." Claire laughed softly. One thing at a time. The conversations came in waves. old friends reminiscing about her early Etsy shop, collectors who had bought her first limited prints, strangers who had stumbled in off the street and were seeing her work for the first time. One older woman, hair silver and tied back in a loose bun, stood for a long time in front of a small piece of layered blues. When she finally turned to Claire, her eyes were wet. "This one, it feels like remembering someone you've lost," she said, but not in a sad way. More like carrying them forward. Claire didn't know what to say at first. Then she simply replied, "That's exactly what I hoped it might feel like." The hours passed quickly. The guest book began to fill with names, sketches, bits of poetry, and messages that would make her cry when she read them later. By the end of the night, the room was still buzzing, but Claire stepped outside for a moment. The air was cool, the street quieter now. Across the street, the gallery glowed, and through the tall windows she could see people still wandering between the pieces. She thought about the road here, the late nights packing orders on her kitchen table, the risk of her first licensing deal, the injury that had forced her to step back, the decision to protect her own creative space. All of it had led to this, not just the show, but the life she had built around it. Inside, Sloan called for her. "We're about to close." Claire took one last look at the street, then stepped back into the warmth. She stood near the anchor piece, letting the hum of voices and clink of glasses wrap around her. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she had to hold the work together. It was standing on its own now, speaking in its own voice. And she realized she had escaped the rat race not by running faster, but by building a place she didn't want to run from. That night, when the last guest left and the lights dimmed, Claire lingered a moment longer. The gallery was silent now, the pieces lit softly in the dark. She walked the room one more time, fingertips brushing the cool edges of the frames. "Thank you," she whispered. She wasn't sure if she was speaking to the work, the space, or the life she'd fought to create. Maybe all three.